Welcome everybody to the symposium of the CUNY Glottopolitical study group. This year's theme is called Narratives and Inequality. We'll start with José del Valle, who will make an introductory remark, and I'll be moderating this event.
Thank you very much, Miki. Welcome everybody. I'm going to be very brief, but there are a couple of things that I would very much like to say. First of all, I want to thank Miki because when we planned this event back in, this was back in June, right, Miki? When we started planning this event, I asked her to sort of take the lead in putting together the symposium. Well, those of you who know Miki already know that she's fabulous, but in case there is anyone out there who might not be acquainted with her, she is not only a brilliant scholar and a wonderful colleague, but has amazing organizational skills. That's very dangerous, by the way, Miki. You know, that might turn you into a department chair or something like that. So be careful with that. Of course, I want to thank the speakers for having agreed to participate in this event. You know, we're all aware of how the level of difficulty and stress associated to our work and to our professional activity has increased tremendously. So accepting yet one more commitment is an act of generosity. And speaking of generosity, well, I want to thank Bonnie URCIUOLI, our special guest, for having accepted to be a part of this event and for having done so so generously. You know, we told Bonnie when we invited her, Bonnie, we have no idea whether we have money, we don't have money, whether we will exist as an institution or not when the time comes. And Bonnie said, no matter what, just tell me when and where, and I will be there. So thank you very much. Just so people know where we're coming from institutionally, well, the organization of this event is located within the PhD program in Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. Some 18, 17 years ago, a decision was made to develop a Hispanic sociolinguistics track within a program that had been traditionally devoted to literature. It was back then when I was hired by the Graduate Center. So that program, that track within the program developed over the years. We were always very small, but feisty. And we were able to focus not on, I mean, rather than going in the direction of building a general Hispanic sociolinguistics program, we decided to focus specifically on what we refer to as a glottopolitical perspective. Glottopolitical meaning the politics of language, that is looking at social phenomena, looking at processes of social change, whose explanation requires taking into account the inseparability of language and politics. So we ended up coming to be known as the Grupo de Glotopolitica, the CUNY, CUNY's group in glottopolitical studies. And over the years, a lot of folks joined us from other disciplines, especially our colleagues from anthropology, thanks to Miki's collaboration over the years, has been quite prominent and has been enriching for all of us. So that's where we are right now. That's what we are. We are an interdisciplinary group that focuses on the politics of language. It's mostly made up of sociolinguists and linguistic anthropologists, but there is certainly a space for other folks, and folks with other, that come from other disciplinary traditions have participated in the group, and we welcome them always. We want to be enriched by different perspectives. And last year, we decided to organize a yearly symposium in which the faculty associated to the Grupo de Glotopolitica would showcase their research. So last year, towards the end of February, probably a couple of weeks just before the pandemic hit and the confinement started, we had our first faculty symposium of the Grupo de Glottopolitica de CUNY. On that occasion, the invited speaker from outside was Jackie Urla, who I think is probably in one of those squares or in another page of this Zoom interface. So if you're there, Jackie, welcome again. And that's basically what I wanted to say. I wanted to give you some information on where you are and where this is coming from. And again, I want to thank everybody who has agreed to participate. The 4 colleagues, Laura, Carolina, Jill, and Sarah, and all of you who decided to join us today. And I send it back to Miki, who will be our MC.
Okay, thank you, Jose, and thank you for the nice introduction of myself as well. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jillian CAVANAUGH, my dear colleague, professor and chair of the Anthropology Department, or Anthropology and Archaeology Department at Brooklyn.
Just anthropology.
Good. Okay, you changed. Okay, Anthropology Department at Brooklyn College. She's also a professor at the CUNY Graduate Center. As a linguistic and cultural anthropologist, her scholarship has covered a wide range of linguistic, anthropological, and other topics, such as language shift, language, gender and sexuality, food, language, media, and materiality. And her ethnography, Living Memory, is a beautiful study of social aesthetics of language, culture, and affective dimensions of language use in Bergamasco in northern Italy. It has quickly become an essential reading for those interested in language and culture and in Europe. She has also co-edited a book on language and materiality with Shalini Sankar. Today, she will talk a little bit about transcription as embodied entextualization, process, transformation, and authority. So go ahead, Jillian.
Thank you so much, Miki, for that super generous introduction. I just want to say this is Brooklyn College behind me, not there in person, but so much, Miki, for that super generous introduction. I just want to say this is Brooklyn College behind me, not there in person, but in spirit. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. I hope that this works. Okay. So as Miki said, this is the title of my talk today. I'm so honored to be included as part of this symposium. The initial one was so amazing and engaging, and I think that it's wonderful we're having a second one, and I look forward to many years to come. I love the theme of narrative and inequality, although I'm not going to talk anything about narrative personally today. I am going to think about inequality and specifically thinking about processes of knowledge production, which we know are always deeply articulated with the production and reproduction of inequality in various kinds of ways. So, and I want to think about, oh, hold on. Okay. I want to think about transcription. And in doing so, I want to make a slight distinction between transcription as product and transcription as process. Now, those of us who are scholars of language in use, we transcribe. It's a basic method for what we do. And we know inherently that it is a process, right? We know that it's something that takes time, it takes energy, and it takes often much more time than we anticipate. Sometimes we receive grant money to pay transcribers. Sometimes we talk them into it out of the goodness of their hearts, but often there are other interlocutors who are involved in that process. And we put transcripts, products, in our published work, right? It's one of the ways that we show the evidence of what we're talking about, how we make our arguments that not just what people say matters, but also how they say it matters, right? And so we offer up excerpts of larger transcripts in our publications in order to build arguments and point to our evidence. Now, in this talk today, I really want to talk about transcription as process, which I think is something we don't talk about enough, and is something that we really should think about because it is a process of knowledge production. It's often interactive, and it's always highly selective. So in doing this, I'm going to talk about particular transcripts or products as scriptions. This is a term that I take from Cecile Vigoro, and I'm going to try to make it a practice not to read my screen. I think you can read it for you, but I think what the advantage of talking about scriptions is it draws attention to particular iterations of how spoken language becomes written language, and that this is something that is highly iterative and that changes over time. And I just want to give you some examples from my own work that I think really expose this process and really hopefully make us think about it. So here's a first transcript. This is, the handwriting is from one of my transcribers, who I'm going to talk more about the particular people in a little while, but I just kind of want to show you some of the transformation, right, in order for us to really think about this. So you can see some of my handwriting. It's the little stuff, making comments along the way, but all the stuff that's in all caps is my transcribing assistant. And it went from this to this. I typed it up, and then there was still kind of some handwriting on it to see it change. And then this is what it looked like. Oh, and this is another one, another iteration of it, where still other things are being kind of attended to on the page. And then this is what it looked like in my book. So again, we can see the kind of sets of transformations that have happened as it went from sound to handwritten to typed again to typeset. And and I think those different scriptions, attending to them, help us recognize the many, many processes that went into this. Here's another initial scription. This one, you can hardly see the transcript at all. What we see here instead is a kind of extended traces of an extended conversation I had with this transcription consultant or transcriber around the sounds of the word that's one of the words that's at the top, mezzo. And she was walking me through some of the sounds that make this pronunciation of what is an Italian word sound like a Bergamasco word. And we did a lot of this kind of talk, trying to figure out how particular utterances or words or even sounds were mixed or not mixed. And so that was also part of this process. We weren't just writing down what we heard, we were discussing what we heard. We were really kind of producing knowledge as we were writing. This is another transcript that or scription that I love to look at, because it's not only a really complicated kind of bit of transcribed speech, but it's also has all these different traces of interactions that this transcriber and I had, or trying to figure out what was being said and how it was being said and how that mattered. The pen is the transcriber, someone I call Rina, and the pencil is me. And you can see, I mean, we could spend a lot of time just looking at this to walk you through it. I know it's pretty confusing, but what it tells me looking back at it is it shows us the kind of repeated sessions that we spent on this one little bit of tape recorded interaction, in that we identified something that caught our interest. She couldn't quite identify what was going on with it. She went and spoke to her grandmother, who was a much better speaker of Bergamasco, as she put it, than she was. She came back, we looked at this again, and tried to figure out what was happening. So again, this is a process that involves lots of people. They may be in the room, they may not be in the room. There's a lot of different ways that expertise gets constructed through our interactions. And then this is what all of that work kind of got distilled into this small bit in my book, right? And I hope that those of you who also transcribe are kind of feeling my pain, right, about all the transcribing we do, and then it gets distilled down into these couple lines that, we have selected, of course, to be exemplary of all those other hours of conversation and work. So none of this should come as any surprise, right? That transcription is a process. That transcription comes out of certain types of positions and choices that we make. Eleanor Oakes in her very early and seminal piece on transcription as theory, made this point about trying to, when you transcribe children's language, it has to look really different than if you transcribe adult language in order to evidence what was going on and why it mattered. And so I offer just this one example from that piece to kind of remind us that, you know, when transcripts look as they usually look, that is a choice as much as when we've chosen to make transcripts look like this, right? And as Oakes stressed, and I will read this quote, what is on a transcript will influence and constrain what generalizations emerge, right? So what we don't transcribe doesn't end up in our analysis. And what we're not interested in also doesn't end up on the page. We hope that, as Durante says, transcription is a discovery procedure, but of course we come to it already with our own ideas about what we're looking for and what we'd like to see. So I'm going to go through some of my transcription processes just again to kind of walk through this now that we've seen some of the descriptions themselves. So I had two different processes that I engaged in, and this is primarily during my initial dissertation fieldwork that led to the book Living Memory that Miki talked about in other publications. So with one set of transcribers, I had 5 transcribers that were all, basically they did, I would log the interaction, listening to the recording, and then give that to them along with the recording. They would do the initial scription, and then we would meet and go over it, sometimes listening to it, sometimes not. But the going over it was a very kind of interactive and evaluative process. And then sometimes that led to them producing other iterations, other scriptions. In the other process, and I did this with 2 of the 5, we did it together. So we sat side by side at my kitchen table, headphones on, close together, kind of huddled over the paper, and listened, wrote, rewound, listened, wrote again. And the descriptions that you've seen so far that were handwritten, those all come out of that particular process, right? So it was a very kind of intimate process where that in a kind of embodied sense, we were really engaged in an activity that involved a lot of kind of spatial intimacy that in turn led to kind of social intimacy. So all of my transcribers were bilingual in Italian and Bergamasco. They made different kinds of claims about their bilingualness, but they all had some, that's a whole other set of questions, of course, that we could get into, but these are all pseudonyms. These are the transcribers who I worked with process 1, and I've included all these details about them because I think they really matter about who was in the room and who wasn't in the room. They were almost all female except for one, Daniele, who I'm going to talk about more in a second. They were all at least college educated, but had differing amounts of kind of expertise in how to, if they had ever transcribed before, if they had training in linguistics, etc. The 2 people that I did the more kind of intimate person, like it seems so intimate right now in this moment to think about sitting together close by people who came into my house and stayed there for a couple hours, and we were kind of all up in each other's faces. But even then it was very kind of intimate. They're both female, as am I. They were both they were very close to my age. One of them, in fact, her birthday is the day after mine, so we're exactly the same age. And both of these people became and remain close friends of mine, which I think really is part of, you know, it's not unrelated to the fact that we spent all this time together, working through these really intense, what were very intense transcribing sessions sometimes in trying to figure out kind of what was Italian and what was Bergamasco. I was really interested in language ideology and had been trained in graduate school before I went to the field that transcription is something that you do with people, and that you, and in transcribing, you listen to what your transcribers are saying so that they can give you their views on what's going on, and that helps you understand. And I want to give a shout out to Bambi Shufflin, who's here today and was my graduate advisor and really trained me in this way. But it means that your transcripts become really rich because they are loaded with people's ideas. about what's going on. So it's not just you as the outsider trying to figure this out. But of course, so my transcribing necessarily was kind of, it was directed in that I was interested in particular kinds of topics, but it was also supposed to be open and revelatory in that I wanted to hear what they had to say. I wanted to listen to what they thought was important in order to really figure out kind of the language ideological side of things and understand how that lined up with practices. Now, this became somewhat problematic when we think about, and in my experiences with Daniele, who was the only male who I transcribed with, he was, and I want to talk about why that was so problematic and difficult. And in order to do that, I want to offer up this notion of embodied entextualization, which I see as the culturally specific ways that bodies produce texts as well as are incorporated into them. And I've used this elsewhere to talk about more about the bodies that end up in texts, but here I want to think about the bodies that produce texts. And I use bodies as kind of a shorthand way of thinking about people as, you know, inhabiting particular social, cultural, economic, political, gendered, racialized positions. And in this case, I think that what really mattered was that we shared certain positions and didn't share other positions. One thing is that we all shared whiteness. Now, the Italian situation is quite different than the US. In certain kinds of ways, whiteness basically means non-immigrant. Of course, I was actually an immigrant as a US citizen in Europe, but I still seem to inhabit that same category and was actively put into it, both by these interlocutors as well as by the state. There were all kinds of ways that I was divided from the immigrants that are seen as racialized others in Italy. And I'm happy to talk about that more if you'd like in the questions. It also really mattered, gender really mattered. And this was really connected to kind of cultural, local heteronormative expectations about social and spatial intimacy. It was no problem to have Rina and Ella come to my house and spend all this time in close proximity over, you know, kind of over and over again. It would have been a problem to have Daniele come and be in my house as a single young man. And it would have felt strange, and it would have been judged as kind of suggesting sexual intimacy. And so that we always met in cafes as a way to kind of maintain those gendered and heteronormative expectations. Class certainly mattered. I mean, you may have noticed that everyone who I transcribed with had at least some college background. That meant that they would have gone through the Italian school system and had certain kinds of ideas about standardization in Italian, but also that a kind of middle class or aspiring middle class position is almost always in Italy kind of or at least often an anti-dialect position. And so that also shaped how they thought about the languages that we were talking about there. And in fact, it was kind of hard to find people who were in the middle class who and educated who would admit to speaking Bergamasco and thus, you know, help me with and were ready to help with transcription in these ways. And then politics really mattered. And really they mattered most in thinking about Daniele, who was a member, as I mentioned, of the Northern League, which is a kind of famously xenophobic, at the time, very separatist, wanting to separate the north of Italy from the south, but at this point is really, really just plain anti-immigrant. Doug Holmes calls these groups integralist groups, but I think at this point in our particular historical moment, we can think of them as kind of authoritarian and really kind of popular right-wing movements. And the thing, so Daniele and I did not share our political background. I picked him because he was a representative of this group, which has a very strong presence in Bergamo, and so is an important part of what language means there. And so I thought it would be valuable to have someone like him in helping me transcribe and giving me his views of language. Now, as we transcribe, as we worked together and we would meet in cafes, what I quickly saw was that his transcripts, the descriptions that he gave to me were pretty accurate. They seemed to reflect that he was listening carefully, but we almost never got through more than a line or two before he would launch into all kinds of different political views about the value of language, the value of local language versus national language, which would lead into other conversations about politics and economics and anti-immigrant kind of stances and all kinds of other things. And while this was really interesting, at first, I quickly came to recognize that it was part of a very familiar genre. I was interacting with Northern Leaguers in other parts of my, my research, and I realized that there's a particular kind of interactive model that they often partake in, which is that it's very monologic in that you can't really, they don't really let other people speak. If you speak and agree with them, then your points are incorporated into theirs. If you speak and disagree with them, you are shouted down. And it's a very kind of gendered position. As I was learning with other people I was interacting with almost entirely men. Most of them were older than me. Daniele was not in this case, but even those who weren't, they were always very eager to work with me. But they wanted to do it in particular kinds of ways. They did it in by saying, "Am I done, Miki? I'm sorry, I can't."
No.
No, okay. They would introduce. They would say, "I'm going to introduce you to people," but they would never actually give me people's phone numbers. It was always on their terms, in their ways. I will introduce you to this person. I will take you to their house. I will set up this meeting. We will go to this place. It will be at the time and at the place that I choose. And by the way, I think your research should go in these directions. And I found this to be really frustrating and really difficult and frankly annoying and really awful. It meant spending a lot of time with people whose views I virulently disagreed with, but also not feeling like I was in any kind of control over my research agenda while I was with them. So by the time I was really interacting with Daniele regularly, I was starting to be really, really limited in terms of the Northern Leaguers that I was interacting with. And ultimately with Daniele, I decided not to work with him anymore because I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. It was too uncomfortable. It was too unpleasant. And I felt like I had enough data. Now, I bring up this example of Daniele to point out that because there was someone who was unlike me and whose political views I disagreed with, I stopped working with him as a source of knowledge. I cut him out of my processes of knowledge production. At this point about my research, I don't feel like that was a great loss, but I think it does provoke us to think about who is left out of these processes of knowledge production for reasons that we might discuss and think of as comfort, right? Or lack of comfort, right? So I want to think about, and then how does this matter to the types of scriptions that we may be working with, right? If we keep in mind that transcription is a process of knowledge production that is going to be just as selective as the scriptions themselves that they produce, what does it mean when we only have certain people in the room and we leave or cut other people out of those processes? What gets erased in those scriptions and what doesn't? Again, I'm not, this is my own view. I think I made the right choice, but that, it might not always be what is the right choice should immediately point us to the fact that these are processes of evaluation that are very personalized and that might be reproducing all kinds of institutional inequalities and, and not be reproducing other types of expertise, authority, access, et cetera, right? So when we make choices like this, there are certainly voices and expertise that don't get recognized and that are ignored, and maybe not even called expertise in certain kinds of ways. So in the longer paper, this is part of a longer paper about knowledge production for the language and language, culture, and society that's under review right now. So it's very much a work in progress. I'm excited to hear what the feedback from people have to say. Other things that come up, of course, in thinking about the issues I've raised right now are issues like interrogating the empiricism of any particular transcript, the ontology of these texts themselves. What are they? How do they exist? What is their truth value, or their claim to be data evidence? And then, of course, transcripts as authoritative texts that tell it like it is, right? That are supposed to represent the world and what happened in certain kinds of ways. So I just kind of gave you one side of it, just thinking about this process and who's in the room. But there's lots of other things that I think are involved, and we could talk about if we want. So I will end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jillian. If people want to unmute themselves to clap,
Well, I don't know.
Elizabeth?
Yes, hi. I was just wondering when you were describing that you had to leave, what was his name? Daniele out. And you describe it as, you're wondering, is it my comfort level? But he's actually trying to dominate the situation, right? He's actually trying to even direct your research. So actually, it was beyond comfort level. I think it would have become an issue to really stay neutral in your approach, rather than having this person really come in and control your research. So
Right. No, I totally appreciate that. And that's exactly why it was not just that he was trying to dominate, it was that he fit into this broader pattern, right? Of that over and over again, I was interacting with Northern Leaguers who were dominating and trying to control, right? And I think that's super important. I think it also kind of hopefully provokes us to think about, when we try to include other voices in our research and in our work in general, what does it mean to cede control over the voices that we represent and are listening to? This seemed to be a pretty easy choice that I wasn't able to, or wanting to cede control. We could talk about the fact that, I was a PhD student and young and female and running into all kinds of gender domination things happening across my fieldwork. So I felt like I was always fighting about it. But, I wonder now that I'm no longer a PhD student and I'm a full professor, right? That, and I know that my position in the field has really changed because of that. Are there people I don't bother to listen to now because I don't have to?
That's interesting to hear. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else would like a question, to ask a question or a comment?
Oh, I do have a question. So I think it's so important that we're able to share your personal experience, talking about some subject that sometimes feels uncomfortable. And I would like to know your approach to share this experience in your academic career, and how can you include that inside the method of, yeah, that's it. How can you include that and go beyond this neutrality that sometimes you picture, which is the academic path?
Are you asking specifically about like research design and thinking about methods? Or are you asking about like how we write about this after the fact?
I think, yeah, how can you communicate that? Because it's part of your experience. So I'm sorry, my English is broken.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think they're both really interesting, right? I mean, I think before we do research, right, we can try to build into our methods as much kind of reflexivity and consideration as we can. Really think about our interlocutors and our, what we share with them and what we don't, and how those dynamics might be shaping what we report about them, who we record, who's in the room when we transcribe, etc. And then I think in our writing, we tend in our writing to have, when we talk about transcription in publications, it ends up often being, reduced to something about transcription conventions, so that we enable people to read the particular descriptions that we had offered. Maybe I know in my book, I had a preface that talked about my transcription process. It didn't say really any of this stuff, but it did talk about, you know, that I transcribed with people, that it was interactive, that I gave them a lot of credit. But of course, it's still my book. It still says only my name on it. And, you know, so we might think about co-authoring with people that we do research with and transcribe with. We might think about including beyond these kind of textually marginal moments in writing, including more about the process and kind of build that into our reflection. I don't think that would necessarily be easy. It's hard enough sometimes to get transcripts into our published work. I know in my own publishing record, there have been times when I've had to fight just to get transcripts included in my publications, much less have than all the fights that I've had with, and I know many, many people who've had similar ones about what they should look like and how they should be lined up, and making sure that when we have English and you know, another language next to each other, that they line up and that they don't go like this so that people can't tell. It's a lot of work to have transcripts included in publication. And so I think it would be another step to be able to say, here's how these transcripts were produced, and have that be a normal part of our writing process, to kind of reveal that as another part of our knowledge production. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that, because when you talk about inequality, it's important to point it out. I'm starting my academic, my academic career, and it's very inspiring to listen to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And we might have a very short question. Joel, I think, has a hand up.
Yeah, and mine is a very quick question. So, to what extent is the target speech community divided on political grounds? Is there evidence one way or the other? And did that actually affect your comfort in not necessarily working with Daniele?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. This talk was not my usual, like, totally scripted out. And so there were some things I wanted to say that got left out. But one of them is the fact that that as I worked more with Northern Leaguers, I noticed that other members of the community were less eager to talk to me, that they saw kind of shared time as indicating shared alignment. And so I realized that if I wanted to have a full kind of complement of voices, I had to minimize the time I spent with Northern Leaguers so that people wouldn't think I was one of them. The community is very divided. The numbers, the percentages have changed over the years, but usually it's ranged around 30% in Bergamo and in the surrounding province that they support the league, as it calls itself now. And other people have differing degrees on it. But if you're not a Northern Leaguer, you often find them very objectionable. And so they're definitely, I would say at least 50% of the people that I worked with, if not more, were really anti-league.
Thank you, Jillian. And so I hope we have maybe some time afterwards to chat and we can continue this conversation, but I'm going to move on to the second speaker, Carolina CHAVEZ-O'FLYNN. She's an assistant professor of Spanish at Queensborough Community College, and she received the PhD from the Graduate Center from our program, and that was entitled Language and Violence in Colombia, Discourses about Linguistic Patrimony. It examines representations of Spanish language in dictionaries and their role in the reproduction of societal inequality in Colombia. The power really of, that she located in the reproduction of the inequality is in the apparent apolitical nature of linguistic representation. And it's a very wonderful dissertation. So she's published since then a number of articles in critical lexicology, Glottopolitical, and discourse analysis. She today is going to talk about, or you can see, On Indians and Arrows, Narratives of Inequality in Colombia. So please join me in welcoming her.
I'm sorry, now you hear me? I was saying thank you, Miki, for your introduction and as well for your invitation, for which I feel very honored, given the opportunity to be surrounded for such amazing scholars. I want to start this presentation, which I have called On Indians and Arrows, Narratives of Inequality in Colombia, with two captions that may serve us as epigraphs for this talk and may provide us some framework for the conversation we're going to have today. And they refer to the meaning of one word that can be found in two different contemporary dictionaries from Colombia. The word is flecha, which, as you already may know, means arrow in Spanish, and the usages cited by these dictionaries are the following. The arrow refers to a mobile phone of poor quality and affordable price, and the term is a result of associating the fact that every Indian has access to one. This same usage is tagged as humoristic by the most important dictionary of Colombian idioms, and it refers to a low-cost cell phone that performs only the most basic functions like making and receiving calls. The fact, of course, that this word appears in dictionaries that brag about preserving the national cultural heritage through language normalizes and legitimizes these type of actions that I would like to refer to as linguistic violences. And with that being said, I want to share with you the work that I'm presenting today, which is really part of an article that I'm still writing. So this is really part of a work in progress at a very early stage. And this work addresses an episode of dispute between an official from the Colombian Ministry of Information, Technologies and Communication, that you see the logo there, also known as the TIC, and a group of representatives of the Cauca Regional Indigenous Council, also known as CRIC. Cauca is a region of Colombia mainly inhabited by indigenous people from the NASA community. This group in particular has suffered from continuous violence from different actors in the Colombian conflict, a violence related to both narcotic mafias and mega development ventures planned and supported by the national government. In the episode we are commenting on today, the NASA indigenous people were asking for greater access to funds and public services given the severity of the impact of the pandemic in their community. The incident I will refer to took place on May 19, 2020, in the middle of the first phase of the pandemic, when some officials from the TIC, the ministry, made denigrating remarks about a group of indigenous people from the CRIC. Right after holding a virtual meeting with them to discuss an economic plan on how to deal with the damages caused by COVID-19 among the indigenous population. Not realizing that the microphone was still turned on, one of the officials said some very insulting things about the representatives of the indigenous organization. So I'm going to play the audio, which is in Spanish, and here is the English translation, which is mine. And from now on, every translation you see will be mine. And of course, I had to edit the audio because for the purposes of this talk and because the original lasts more than 7 minutes. So this version only contains the comments that I want to highlight for this conversation. I'm going to play it now. I hope you hear it well.
Esa conexión, esos 300.000 pesos, lo que van a hacer, Juan, es comprarse unas cheflas, unas flechas y una tarjeta MIR. Eso es lo que van a hacer. Esa es dotación de un punto de internet por resguardo. Exacto. Y se la reparten en el transporte, en busetas. Tal vez hijo de putas, porque ellos nunca van a cambiar y van a ser miserables y son todos barbarios.
Okay, so I must say as well that although I don't show it here, the interlocutors of the ministry employee, this guy that appears in the picture, did not show any disagreement or confusion for his words. but rather a general acceptance of his remarks. Once the audio recording was discovered and the scandal escalated to the level of the mass media, the institutional reactions were immediate. The TIC ministry released a statement through its Twitter account, officially repudiating any disrespectful action toward indigenous communities, which do not represent the ministry position at all, but openly contradict the guidelines of its portfolio. Moreover, the Ombudsman Office, which is the national government agency that is in charge of protecting the civil human rights of Colombian citizens, rejected the language and the racist attitude of these public officials against the members of the CRIC. On the other hand, the reactions of the indigenous communities seem more detailed and show more contextual issues than those from the administration. The ONIC, which is the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia, stated that this was yet another page in the systematicity with which the dominant elites in Colombia, ingrained in the state, have been consolidating an economic, social, cultural, and environmental genocide of indigenous people, which is further reinforced by the armed conflict within the country. For its part, the CRIC declared that xenophobia and racism must not continue to control the national governance, since this is a situation that consolidates the genocide of indigenous people from way back in the past. The CRIC also released a statement in which it demanded the identification of the officials involved in the whole offensive conversation, their immediate firing, and the presentation of public apologies by the national government to the indigenous people, of course. The officials were in fact identified and removed from their positions, and the Duque government, Duque is the president, presented their public apologies to the communities brought together by the CRIC. So far, we could just say that the case has been solved and that we can all move on since the official apologies were already made and the guilty parties were already fired. Unfortunately, however, we all know it's not as simple as that, and there is not follow-up in any way on this case. In addition to the obvious gravity of the insults, there are three perplexities to which I want to call your attention, because I think they feed upon each other and sustain the ideology revealed in the recorded attacks that we are considering today. So the first of these is the inconsistency between private and public discourse among members of the government agency, which is the TIC, and the case is significant because it reveals personal viewpoints and real discourse among ministry employees with respect to indigenous communities. And yet the solution trivializes the matter by assuming that blaming and firing just few people, the few people involved in the scandal, will solve the structural problem of racism within the ministry. And furthermore, it creates this feeling that this is an isolated incident, a question of some few bad apples in a single institution, and not a matter of systemic bigotry in government agencies. And in that sense, the officials involved just seems to be unsuspected bullies who had gone undetected by the institution, in which case the public apologies and summary firing should have settled the government debt to the indigenous people, and the entire issue should be already solved. And this is also evident in the second aspect that I want to highlight, which is the contrast between the statements of the government and those of the indigenous organizations. As you have seen, the ministry response suggests the exceptionality of the racism revealed in the incident, whereas the reactions of the indigenous communities emphasizes long and deep-rooted persistence, and of course the negative repercussions throughout the history of the nation. In a few words, the national government sees the problem as an extrinsic event, while the indigenous communities experience it as a systemic matter. And finally, I want to highlight the outspoken protagonist's conviction that indigenous people are, in his opinion, stupid and wretched. And I want to comment on his disdain for the entitlement demands of indigenous communities. I consider this very important because despite the fact that what he meant by stupid and wretched was not explained, the message was easily understood and apparently accepted by those who were listening to him. And this suggests that there is a consensual set of beliefs with this particular institution at least that allows the listeners to perceive the meaning of the statements without further explanation. And that is why I want to refer today precisely to what is not being said in these statements and yet is understood by all the parties involved. To approach that message that is not pronounced yet is in fact transmitted, I want to bring up a series of markers that I found in the webpage of the TIC Ministry that may shed some light on what was meant by stupid and wretched in reference to the indigenous communities. So what I did here was to put to place in the left corner the original article that I found in the webpage of the ministry, and I extracted some bullet points from the article that I translated for you, and I placed them in the right corner. Some of the examples that I want to point out, of course, include this article that you see in the visual, and in which a group of 10 different indigenous members of 10 different indigenous communities from 10 different regions of the country are nonetheless referred as to only one generic group, as a generic group with the same collective features. And this creation of uniformity of the entire indigenous community disregards the multiplicity of cultural thinking of this group, greatly simplifying, of course, their political complexity. As you can see from the title, Jóvenes entre lo ancestral y la tecnología, there seems to be an epistemological distance to be overcome between the ancestral and technology, which leads to a Western sense of history as a linear universal trajectory, whereas indigenous people appear to be at the very beginning of this evolutive line. And there are also common references to their cultural pride, their clothing, their worldviews, etc. And of course, at this point, it is impossible not to notice the persistence of an us versus them narrative that portrays indigenous people as primitive learners of a supplementary, useful, more evolved knowledge that emanates from the center of the nation. As the colonialist scholars put it, there is a treatment of culture as a set of signifying systems with exotic connotation that reduces alternative thinking to a subaltern knowledge. These 10 members of indigenous communities are also characterized as young potential carriers of doubts. And although we don't know what kind of doubts they are referring to, it is clear they are framing indigenous people as inexperts and unskilled on a certain form of indisputable and positive knowledge. The 10 indigenous youths are also shown as speakers displaying some difficulty in communicating in Spanish. In addition, the term literate is used in connection with the domain of technology, thus showing the superior status granted to written languages over the oral traditions so highly valued by indigenous communities. These linguistic choices, plus the profiling of indigenous people as having communicative handicaps, instead of recognizing their bilingual skills, not only shows the dominant power of Spanish as a normative language, but also erases the political tensions involved in this particular situation of diglossia. Let's remember that although the Colombian Constitution from 1991 recognized the official character of the languages and ethnic minorities in their own territories, it also meant the linguistic superiority of the Spanish language over the others. This implies that indigenous people must master at least two languages, Spanish and their own, while those who speak Spanish as their primary language can make themselves understood in any part of the national territory without learning a single native language. And these inertias are tied to the validation of language based on their commercial potential, which in turn leads to a language ideology that understands bilingualism as the ability to speak Spanish and other majority language like English, French, German, etc., but also, no, I'm sorry about that, but also fails to apply the same concept to the use of Spanish and an indigenous language, much less to the mastery of two indigenous languages. So these considerations, plus the unsolicited comments on the appearance and manners of the indigenous visitors, entail underlying binary representations related to notions of barbarism and civilization, myth and science, poverty and development. Categories that are all strongly oriented towards the achievement of an ideal of well-being associated with a neoliberal vision of progress and development. All of these take us to another type of representation, in which this idea of majority language bilingualism is considered a basic requirement for a high quality education. And it is also intrinsic to a culture of marketing in which language skills are seen as commodity that is destined to expand the job market opportunities of Colombians and their new generations. Here, the erasure of indigenous languages from the quality educational project is not at all innocent. If an indigenous language is lost, one more political voice of opposition to the neoliberal project is also lost. Hence, this unequal attention to the majority versus indigenous languages coexist with the dynamics of discrimination and eventual disappearance of indigenous communities in Colombia. And this is in fact what Claude Zimmerman has called indirect forms of aggression against languages, where national policies of tolerance and linguistic inclusion are nevertheless in a strong contradiction with other economic practices. Looking at this slide, I also want to highlight the very recurrent archetype of achieving the fourth industrial revolution through the implementation of new information and communication technologies across the country. This is relevant because while indigenous people demand resources for the installation of radio station and television channels to strengthen their local community ties and their political agency and autonomy, the government channels resources into training indigenous people to become entrepreneurs in the field of tourism, handicrafts, in which their cultural traditions are advertised as exotic entertainment and merchandised for eco-friendly tourists. And look at this case where this is exemplified. And notice as well how this is yet another case where the linear trajectory from the primitive past to the supposedly promising future is traced once again through the title of the article, De la Selva a la Web. Also notice the way in which cultural traditions are sold as services that typically include hiking, room with exotic views, a river ride, staying with the community, in houses built by the community, and even a chat with an elder who is also an expert on local cosmology. This, if I'm not mistaken, I hope I'm not, is an example of the capitalization of experience that URCIUOLI highlights on her works. Another issue that should be underscored is the patronizing tone used to refer to indigenous people, almost as minors, and I quote, full of dreams and hopes, in the pursuit of happiness as represented in the commodification of their cultural features. Moreover, tourism as the handicrafts are established as the only means of subsistence for the community. This, although every indigenous culture belonging to the Creek has planned and implemented indigenous economic systems based on sustainability and self-reliance. As a matter of fact, the Creek members have voiced alarms about the overexploitation of resources by third parties impacting their cultural identity and food self-sufficiency. Miki, how much time do I have? I'm okay? Bueno, listo. Hence, although indigenous communities are highly organized and politically vigorous and active, the way in which they are being presented by the ministry programs contradicts their entitlement and political power. And to summarize some of these narratives collected from the webpage that correlate with the bigotry expressed by the official, whose insulting remarks about the members of the Creek were captured on this open microphone, let's take a look at this list of us versus them comments that equate the indigenous with the wretched and stupid. They don't speak well, they don't know what the money is for, they don't understand the global labor market, they don't know how to use technology, they don't know how to make money off it, and they don't put national resources to good use. Therefore, indigenous economy autonomy equals poverty, and they don't know what is good for them. In other words, to approach the inclusion of Colombian indigenous people in the national panorama consists of training them as entrepreneurs and mystifying them as guardians of the environment, rather than dealing with them as partners in the conversation in the public arena. However, even more serious than that is an underlying belief that holds all these narratives together. And is the idea that indigenous people must be represented by others who can mediate between them and the government because they lack the capacity to speak out or to participate in politics on their own. And this is not trivial in a country where the claims of indigenous communities are precisely about the right to self-determination and political autonomy, and where participation is subject to the possession of land. Even more disturbing, this is a country where opposing neoliberal projects of the moment implies forced displacement or murder at the hands of different armed agents who seek to deprive people of their land for the exploitation of resources for the neoliberal market. As of today, 167 indigenous leaders have been assassinated during the presidency of Iván Duque. And at this precise moment, around 10,000 indigenous people from the Cauca province, known as the Colombian Indigenous Guard, are on a march to Bogota to demand their right to political participation without being murdered. The Indigenous Guard is composed by men, women, and children who defend their land and their autonomy. I'm sorry. And one can only wonder why, their weapons are no longer arrows, but command batons that you can see in the picture. And one can only wonder why the Colombian dictionaries don't honor these more majestic meanings that point to the dignity and political agency of indigenous people on this country. And that we all want, that will be all what I want to say today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. I invite you all to unmute yourself and clap and raise hands to ask questions.
Elizabeth, I think Elizabeth is raising her hand.
Okay. Somehow I don't see it, but yes, please go ahead.
I was just appalled, but not surprised at all at the recasting of the racialized subject, the indigenous, as incompetent, childlike, less intelligent, not able to communicate in the language, right? And not being able to be autonomous because, you know, here they're getting all of this money, but they don't know how to use it. So there's a total recasting of peoples like dependent, which would justify them being slaves, that type of a thing, right? Outside of the system, and they don't have to be recognized if they're not capable, right? So kind of like the same type of thing that would have taken place during slavery here, right?
Right, and this comes back to the 17th century where, can I be wrong with the date? With de las casas used to call them miserable and poor just to have the access to their land, I mean, to control their right to the land. So this is nothing new, indeed. It's just an evolution of the same type of slavery that we had before.
Yeah, but the fact that it's happening now, you know, I mean, how come things haven't changed after hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So it's still the same type of strategies, tools of how to recast them in that light, so that the racism just can be systemic through everything.
Yeah,
that was my comment.
Juan Rodriguez Aponte.
Hello. Wonderful presentation, first of all. I couldn't help but to see in the course of your presentation that there is a kind of a double poetic move in the things that you are showing, and in this recasting of indigenous peoples as dependents. From the one hand, you have this movement in the text that goes constantly trying to move things from to, right? From pre-modern to modern things. There's there a kind of a chronotopic move, but also there's a form of semantic inversion in terms. I mean, if you take a look to the semantic of extension that people do of arrow, right? To also mean this very traditional thing that is an arrow, to make it this very technologically modern thing that is the cell phone, on the one hand, and on the other hand, when people refer to technology, they actually narrow down the meaning of technology to modern technology, so that it doesn't extend into the past, and it doesn't include any other form of things. It becomes metonymical of a form of modernity. So there is this kind of play, this semantic play between the arrow and technology. The arrow doesn't get to be technology, right? But the technology get to be an arrow. Is my point.
Yes.
But there is this move, right? The arrow doesn't get to be technology, but technology doesn't. I mean, doesn't extend to the arrow, and it's a semiotic topic thing that is happening there. That is really fascinating. I think
interesting. I haven't considered that.
Yeah, that it might be a move that it would be nice to see if you are developing the paper still. And
Thank you.
And I don't know, I mean, what do you think about that?
No, I haven't considered that, but I find it very interesting. Yes, I will have to give it a thought. No, I don't know just yet. Muy bien. Thank you.
Yeah, no, if I can say something, just one more thing too. The fact that these people were fired though, those what
Officers from the ministry.
rats, yeah, or officers, whatever. The fact that they were fired though, I know that you could see that obviously as, yeah, that's not gonna fix the problem, but I also see that as a good thing, that there's not going to be tolerance for that. So
Yeah,
it shouldn't be sanctioned. So it's good that they were removed. Now, probably what is going to happen is they just get placed somewhere else. They
right. There is not a promise of follow. There is not a promise of follow up in the matter. So that's why I think we have to emphasize in the fact that it's not solved just with that, although that is a good thing. Yeah, I mean, it sets a precedent.
Yeah.
Eso es en inglés.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Carolina. We'll have more conversations afterwards. Okay, everybody, welcome back to our symposium on narratives and inequality. We're gonna move on to the third speaker of the day, Sarah MUIR. She's an assistant professor of anthropology, gender studies, and international studies at the City College. And she's also a professor at the, or doctoral faculty at anthropology here at the Graduate Center. She's interested, among many other things, language and social class, economy and politics. She has conducted extensive research in Argentina, and in her work, she's examined the practical logic of economic investment, ethical evaluation, and political critique, with a particular focus on how people talk about it, these things, social class and financial crisis. She combines linguistic, ethnographic, political, economic, and historical analysis in her work, and her monograph, Routine Crisis, an ethnography of the illusion, is coming out soon. Today, she will present The Eyes of Poverty, Argentine Narratives of Material and Ethical Inequality. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Miki. Let me see if I can share my slides. Yeah, I think I'm sharing my slides, right? Okay. Hopefully now. Okay. Thank you so much, Miki, and to the whole Glottopolitical group. I'm so happy and honored to participate, and I've really enjoyed the conversation so far, and I look forward to more of it. As Miki said, the title of my talk today is The Eyes of Poverty, Argentine Narratives of Material and Ethical Inequality. And it has to do with the role of narrative in producing and regimenting different modes of inequality in the Argentine context. And as she also so kindly said, it's part of a larger book project, the Routine Crisis and Ethnography of Disillusion, that will be published in January. The book in general focuses on a 5-year period following the 2001-2002 Argentine financial crisis, which was a dramatic event involving the largest sovereign default in world history, poverty rates over 50%, and massive social dislocations, all in a country that had once promised the story of middle-class progress, political stability, and widespread prosperity. And in that situation, the general sentiment was that what people called neoliberalism had wrought irrevocable havoc on the country. The overall concern of the book is the question of how everyday discursive practices among the middle class simultaneously provided for these sorts of radical insights, while also limiting the transformative possibilities of those insights. And today I'll be focusing on those larger dynamics as they played out in practices of what people called solidarity building, or fomentar la solidaridad, in a community organization called the Villarrobles Center. Okay, so first, inequality and why it became a problem, recognized as a problem in this context. Located in a suburban municipality about an hour's drive from downtown Buenos Aires and housed in a textile factory that had closed in the mid-1990s, the VALLE Center was a nonprofit organization run by paid staff and volunteers, most of whom hailed from the nearby neighborhood of Catalinas, which lay literally across the railroad tracks from VALLE. And here I'll just note that I'm using pseudonyms for places, institutions, and individuals. Most of the volunteers and staff from Catalinas struggled financially during these years following the crisis, as they had become unemployed or their incomes had plummeted. Nonetheless, whatever their current situation, they took up a middle-class footing in both public and private spaces. Relative to their clients, they had more years of schooling, more experience traveling, and a history of employment in the formal economy. They lived in houses that were more solidly built, full of costlier furnishings, and located on paved streets. So just to give you some visuals of the contrast between Catalinas and VALLE, here's a typical street in Catalinas and one across the tracks in VALLE. Here's a house in Catalinas and one in VALLE. And here's an interior living room in Catalinas and across the tracks. The center thus brought together people whose daily lives were segregated along historically sedimented, familiar patterns of material inequality, the signs of which were immediately legible to all concerned. Inequality had become the cause of increasing public concern over the 1990s when a neoliberal structural reform program dismantled the institutions that had once undergirded the claim, which was of course never fully realized, that Argentina was a country of equals, a country essentially and paradigmatically middle class. And so by the 2001-2002 financial crisis, these signs of inequality came to index a generalized existential threat to the nation. Efforts to counteract that threat were framed as solidarity building initiatives. The VALLE Center, for example, was dedicated to helping neighborhood residents solve some of their most pressing material problems. Accordingly, there was a nursery school, which is what's pictured here, a soup kitchen, medical doctors and psychoanalysts, a computer class for teens and adults, and a job postings board that was almost always empty. However, for employees and volunteers from Catalinas who ran the center, meeting these kinds of material needs was not an end in itself. Rather, material aid was meant to serve as a vehicle for something altogether more transcendent, solidarity. This quotation comes from a 2003 volunteer orientation center at the VALLE Center. In post-crisis Argentina, the folk concept of solidarity drew on an array of traditions, even as it distinguished itself from them. It conjured certain aspects of leftist politics, of Catholic social dogma, and of a Peronist concern with social cohesion. However, it named something else. It named a utopian mode of explicit, heartfelt, intersubjective commitment, which would express itself in acts of generosity. In sum, solidarity in post-crisis Argentina bore a strong family resemblance to practices of ethicized, voluntaristic social care and belonging that analysts have identified in neoliberal contexts from Italy to Myanmar. What's interesting is that here, solidarity workers were as keenly aware as any anthropologist of the hierarchical potential of gifting. As a result of that awareness, coupled with an enduring commitment to the idea that Argentina should be a country of equals, solidarity workers were at pains to ensure that both worker and client occupied an equal footing with respect to interpersonal ethics, even if they inhabited materially unequal positions with respect to income, living conditions, and so on. And toward that end, one of the principal tools solidarity workers employed was what I've come to think of as a conversion narrative. Recounting their path from self-interest to solidarity, middle-class volunteers and staff frequently performed their newfound commitment to the poor. Those performances typically took the form of a story about ethical awakening. As with many Christian conversion narratives, these secular acts of self-narration both represented and enacted a subjective transformation by which people left behind their particularistic identities in order to embrace an egalitarian community of committed practice. People at the Villarrobles Center described these narratives along just these metapragmatic lines. They explained to one another, as well as to me, that sharing these stories helped ensure, as one volunteer put it, that everyone was acting out of a commitment to end the inequality that otherwise will end this country. In other words, the ritualized performance of ethical awakening figured routinely as a pedagogical ritual aimed at calibrating the motives of speakers and addressees. However, these narratives, as I will go on to show in a moment, these narratives paradoxically presupposed and entailed the regimes of evaluation and the registers of resemblance and distinction that undergirded the very inequalities they sought to eradicate. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that by looking at a December 2004 conversation between Patricia, a Villarrobles worker, and myself. It took place one hot morning in the kitchen of the center. Patricia walked in and slowly worked her way around toward the topic of solidarity. After a great deal of chit-chat, she broached the central issue, saying, "We meet with the new volunteers so that we can talk about why we're here." Now, the plot line of what she went on to say is important, and so I'll quote it at length. And thinking so much about Jillian's great presentation about scriptions, these are a series of scriptions that really focus on the plot of what unfolds rather than other issues. And we could talk about the other issues that are sort of not being highlighted in what I present here. At any rate, of particular interest are Patricia's temporalization of the narrated event in relation to the narrating event, the play of resemblance and difference that she establishes between the various characters, and the dramatic event of radical subjective transformation that she recounts. So I'm going to start, it'll go on at some length. I hope you'll bear with me. She said, "You know, Sarita, solidarity, cooperation, it's essential in this country above all else, because during the era of neoliberalism, we weren't very solidary. We Argentines, we middle-class people, we didn't think about others. Everything changed with the crisis. We woke up. I woke up. I realized that solidarity was missing. At that time, the streets were full of poor people in situations you can't even imagine. You couldn't remain unaware without doing anything." So note, to begin with, the disavowal of her previous self, the dramatic waking up, the idea that everything changed with the crisis, which figures as a pivot point, a clear rupture with before and an after in the life of the country, of the middle class, and of the self. She went on, "One day," she said, "right in the middle of that full-blown crisis, I'm going to my parents' house. You know what my parents are like, very middle class, very proper, very hardworking. Well, so one day in the middle of the crisis, well, you know how it was. I'm going to the dinner that my parents have every Saturday. The whole family gets together. I get off the bus, I'm a couple of blocks from the house where I grew up, and do you know what I see? A man, older, the age of my grandfather, and Sarita, I tell you the honest truth, I was captivated. He looked like my grandfather in a way that was so incredible." And here, note the switch to the historical present, right? And the way she slowed down, especially with the word captivated, or in Spanish, cativada, iconically reenacting the way this encounter literally arrested her movement. She said, "I freeze. With my grandfather's light blue eyes, with my grandfather's hair. He's even dressed like my grandfather, very well dressed. And you know how it was I knew he was not my grandfather? Because he's eating in the street, looking for food in the trash, a horrible thing. And at that moment, Sarita, I realized all of a sudden I understood that I couldn't remain quiet, that I had to do something to help the other, that this man could have been my grandfather and he was eating trash." And this here is the key moment of her narrative. He resembles her grandfather, but someone like her grandfather shouldn't be in the street. That dissonance, that disjunctive resemblance is what she credits with her subjective transformation, with her ethical awakening. She explains, "With this, I started to live differently. I woke up to what was happening in this country, and within a year, here I was working, cooperating with the people of this neighborhood to improve things. You know, Sarita, that I'm poor. I'm one of those new poor, if you think about it. And that's why I know what this country needs. I know what we can achieve. And that's what I want to give to the kids in this neighborhood. These kids who never formed part of the national project because they couldn't. That's how I started working here. Now I should note, and I should note that the new poor was a term that emerged in the 1990s to refer to middle-class people who had fallen beneath the poverty line, but had retained social or cultural commitments to middle-class mores, practices, and identities, especially with respect to what she called the national project. So Patricia, as a member of the new poor, figures herself as someone who bridges the gulf between the poor and the middle class and can be a vehicle for national regeneration. And it was at this point that she turned to me. And you, Sarita, how about you? What brought you to Solidarity work? Now, I just want to briefly kind of pull out two sets of features of Patricia's narrative that are especially crucial. First, as is really obvious here, Patricia recruited me to the role of an interlocutor who was potentially, if not yet fully, on equal footing by asserting that I knew what her parents were like, what the crisis was like, and so on. She projected an increasing degree of similarity and even intimacy between us, a projection that culminated at the end of her narrative when she turned the question back to me. Patricia knew I was not Argentine, that I had not been in the country during the crisis itself, that I had never met her parents, and so on. And yet she addressed me, someone who presented like her as middle class and white, as if we shared a social world in which a great deal of knowledge could be assumed and pointed to with a simple, you know. She thus laid the ground for the intersubjective calibration of motive that was the explicit aim of the conversation. Second, that calibration revolved around her narrative of her 2002 encounter with the man in the street. That encounter stood in for the crisis in general as the catalyst for her newfound solidarity. In her framing, that awakening was personal, but it was also national and middle class, as in her use of the pronoun we, to refer ambivalently to both Argentina and middle-class people. Further, that awakening hinged on the alleged resemblance between the poor man and her grandfather. Now, in the Argentine context, the particular qualities Patricia picked out, light blue eyes, well-dressed, and so on, are clearly coded for both class and race. And in Patricia's comments, these classed and racialized qualities become, in turn, signs of possible kinship. For this reason, they provoked particular outrage, for she gives us to understand one would expect someone like that to be attending a family dinner, not eating garbage. That dissonance transforms Patricia in her telling through a sudden awakening, which she narrated for dramatic emphasis in the historical present, an awakening that converted her into a new kind of person with expanded horizons of action that transcended the self and oriented her toward the good of others. Altogether, then, the poetics of Patricia's narrative positioned the poor man as a figure of grace, an unexpected gift of ethical clarity. But he did not figure as an interlocutor. And here I'm reminded a bit of the previous presentation, right, about folks who are positioned not as interlocutors, but as people who have to be spoken for. This old man in Patricia's story was relegated to what Bonveniste calls the grammatical non-person. He stood as a third-person object that made possible Patricia's subjective transformation into an ethically authoritative speaking I, a position that Patricia invited me to take up by opening up a space for me to recount a presumably similar experience of awakening. By the end of her narrative, then, Patricia has knitted together the narrating and narrated events in such a way as to reanimate, paradoxically, the registers of material inequality that solidarity is meant to overcome. In other words, her narrative functioned as a technology of intersubjective of intersubjective calibration, even as it was also a pedagogical site for learning to see all over again distinctions of class and race. Over the course of my fieldwork, and this is fieldwork I carried out for my dissertation, which is now going to be a book, I heard or participated in 23 fully fledged instances of these narratives. And I heard countless other abbreviated versions. However, while Patricia's narratives was utterly commonplace among middle-class people, I never heard a similar one from clients at the Villarrobles Center or any of the other organizations where I spent time. That was not for want of trying on the part of workers. In community building meetings and other semi-formal gatherings, solidarity workers would frequently invite clients to rehearse a story of coming to solidarity. But what clients offered in response rarely seemed to satisfy. So I'm going to show a short excerpt from another conversation between Patricia and a group of teenagers in the computer class at the Villarrobles Center. Patricia was leading this meeting and was attempting to mold it into a stage for the reenactment of these kinds of solidarity awakenings. But the teenagers, perhaps unsurprisingly, were guarded in their speech and declined to take up the role Patricia offered them. So she says, well, guys, we're going to talk a little bit about solidarity, about the importance of solidarity, about what solidarity is. What does it mean to be solidary? How do we build it and why? Who feels like saying something? Ernesto, do you want to begin? And Ernesto kind of reluctantly says, yeah, well, I just want to say that by yourself, you can't do anything. By yourself, you can't solve your problems. You need solidarity. Look, all this, everything we've done in this neighborhood, we achieved it through solidarity. And Patricia's kind of excited here. She's like, oh, he's taking this up. Yes, and how can we build it? Was it always this way? Were you always solidary? She looks around and no one offers anything. So she comes back to Ernesto again. Ernesto, do you want to say something? For you, how is it that the people of this neighborhood learned to be solidary? Well, we all know the difficulties we've been through. We never had things easy. We've always had to help each other. But yeah, with the crisis, things got worse and we came here. The center helped us all in the neighborhood to survive. And Patricia sort of peters out here. She says, yes. Does someone else want to comment? Okay, well, let's talk about something a little more concrete, next week's party. So in this short conversation, Patricia attempted to offer Ernesto and the other teenagers the grounds for an equal footing. She elicited a story of ethical awakening, but Ernesto and the others could not articulate one, not because they did not have their own histories and personal experiences of the crisis and of working in solidarity, nor because they didn't have their own sense of ethical responsibilities to their neighbors, but because they understood and had experienced the crisis to be simply a moment when things got worse, a more processual temporalization than the one Patricia's story offered. Ernesto offered no story of personal transformation. As a result, although Patricia assented to his narrative, it did not give her the resources with which to launch a broader or deeper discussion of solidarity. Instead, she found herself compelled to shift to something else, the following week's party and its logistical questions. And so even when invited to take up an egalitarian footing, Ernesto could not do so. The events that brought him to the center were taken by all concerned to be fundamentally different from the ones that had brought Patricia. Ernesto came to the center to solve material problems of day-to-day survival and later to take computer classes, not because of a conversion experience that had awakened him to a new ethical commitment. Not only did he continue to live in Villarrobles while Patricia continued to live across the tracks in Catalinas, not only did he continue to command a dramatically lesser valued set of cultural, political, and economic capital than Patricia, but he was also newly effectively barred from narrating his own ethical awakening and therefore from assuming a position of ethical equality within the center itself.
Your mic.
Okay. I offered up as the antidote to neoliberalism-induced poverty and national crisis, solidarity building projects like the Villarrobles Center approached inequality as a problem not primarily of systematic disempowerment and resource distribution, but of interpersonal ethics and motivations. And so paradoxically, the narrative rituals aimed at creating an equal footing ended up creating a new pattern of ethical inequality, laminated on top of and reinforcing entrenched relations of class and racialized material inequality. The conversion narratives not only performed the subjective transformation they recounted, They also reanimated registers of distinction and regimes of value that defined the parameters of that transformation. Of course, such is the work of ritual, which produces that which it displays. As such, these narratives served a dual pedagogical purpose. They guided people as they attempted to reshape their motivational and affective structures according to the ideals of solidarity, but they also taught people to see classed and racialized distinctions in a context where the stability and clarity of those distinctions had come under some strain. Despite the social and economic upheavals that residents of Catalinas and Villarrobles had undergone in recent decades, conversion narratives recontextualized those longstanding registers of class and race and made them newly relevant. In conversion narratives like Patricia's then, we can see starkly one way in which solidarity as a mode of ethicized civility reanimates the inequalities it would overcome. Again, for Patricia, the encounter with the man on the street was a moment of grace, an unexpected rupture of the everyday that propelled her into what she felt to be a transcendent, ethicized, ethically valorized space of solidarity. However, Ernesto was not able to access that grace nor that regime of ethical value because the genre of the conversion narrative was made unavailable to the structural as opposed to the new poor. They are thus barred from taking up the national and middle class I and we. And so they are grammatically relegated to the position of evidence about whom much can be said, but who are not authorized to assume equal footing in the national conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let us unmute ourselves and clap. I invite people to raise hands or chat or actually ask questions and comment.
Oh.
Anyone?
Can I?
Oh, Elizabeth?
Yeah. Have you thought, Sarah, about this? Have you thought, Sarah, about this idea of conversion narratives within the perspective of Evita Perón and how this is within the culture in Argentina? And so to me, it was like this idea of the woman, the sense of mission, that almost that religious experience of working for the poor, it was just like seeing Evita Perón for me, you know. And maybe this is part of how these middle class women see themselves as, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very much kind of picking up an existing genre, right? That is absolutely available and ready to hand. Even for those who don't identify at all as Peronist or sympathetic with the Peronist project, it's deep that this genre is deeply seeped into middle class ways of talking about and engaging with the poor, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, besides, I think that Evita is not seen, and I don't think people need to be Peronistas, you know, like to admire Evita. So I wonder if within the archetype of somebody who, of women, this is part of that explains also this conversion. I don't know.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. And it's not just, Patricia is my subject here, but it's something that was also kind of equally articulated by men. But absolutely, right. But I would say even folks who would explicitly disavow Evita could be heard talking along these lines, precisely because her examples, right, of this have circulated so broadly, have diffused in such a kind of generalized way that it's just sort of in the air.
Very nice.
Bonnie?
I just wanted to comment how much I was struck in both Sarah's and Carolina's presentations. And I also heard it a bit in the comments from Elizabeth and from Juan, I think, Mr. Rodriguez, that it seems to me to be a kind of running theme of this disciplining of narratives, like the only way in which a certain class of person or type of person that's seen as somehow lower down on a scale is not in charge of their own narratives, and they have to, you know, they can't be heard unless those narratives are restructured to follow some kind of meta-semiotic regime that's set by, you know, people who see themselves as arbiters but sympathetic, or want to look sympathetic even though they've been caught on hot mic trashing, you know, as Carolina pointed out. And it was just a thing that struck me, because I'm going to be talking about that too. But anyway, I was just wondering if you guys had any responses to that.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, I think that just hits the nail on the head. And that's something that, that's exactly what I'm sort of interested in tracing, how that happens, even in places and in contexts where people understand themselves to be working against that, right? And, you know, Delheim's, right, talks about kind of narrative inequality, right? And it seems like to me that this is the kind of thing that he is trying to get at with that, in that phrase that he coins, right? The ways that genres of narrative invite certain people to be able to speak as an authorized narrator and bar others, right? Just as much as they create publics of presumed addressees and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To the point where you wonder, come on, who are you really talking to when you're giving these, you know, oh, so sympathetic, but really telling other people how to be who they're supposed to look like.
And going back to what Carolina, you know, I'm so happy Carolina mentioned De Las Casas, right? Like Trujillo makes this point when he's talking about the savage slot in anthropology of tracing it all the way back to the argument between De Las Casas and Sepúlveda about los indios, right? Who figure as this object that are debated about, but who do not speak in the argument, right? We have De Las Casas' voice, we have Sepúlveda's voice, and we see it both in Carolina's, I think, example, and here as well, a similar formal structure, right? That's just highly portable, highly iterable, right? Yeah.
Can I say something real quick? I'm also so struck, Sarah, in this wonderful presentation about the move of including you as her interlocutor, right? And how powerful that is, thinking about the audiences and publics that are getting conjured here, and thus really giving strength to the very voices that are speaking, right? So it's like who you're speaking to, how do you conjure that interlocutor, and then what kind of interlocutor is getting interpolated in that? So, yeah, you know, through sameness, not through difference.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I didn't talk about this much here, but I hope I alluded to it sufficiently. But yeah, I mean, the fact that I'm this like white middle-class woman, importantly from the United States, is a very convenient resource, right, for people to draw upon, because if I can hear this narrative and affirm or reply or somehow validate it, right, it's even, because it's in this context even more authorizing, because right, because of the kind of way in which geopolitically, right, folks understand Argentina to be in relationship to the US. And so my presence allows this narrative to circulate and have an even kind of, to seem to have an even broader and more deeply grounded authorization, right, than it would for, yeah.
I feel like if nobody's written about this, I feel like we should co-write a piece about the use of the anthropologist.
You're on. I will totally do that.
I would have a lot to say about that as well. I think most of us would, right? That we get recruited to do certain kind of work.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other question? Maybe one more? Is this Kaya?
Yep. Yeah, greatly appreciated, and would that I didn't have to run to another meeting. I'm feeling everything that I'm hearing. I got on a little bit late. I'm wondering about this question of solidarity, particularly through the quote that you gave us about he could have been my grandfather, and you know, I think that this move of like, they could have been my blank, and this kind of familial relation, you know, happens a lot. One of the more kind of perhaps memorable ones with Obama referring to Trayvon Martin. You know, I revisited that somewhat recently. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on that as it connects to solidarity kind of more broadly, and how, you know, oftentimes solidarity is expressed as a means that the connective tissue of solidarity is often construed and imagined as perhaps transcending these kind of more naturalized, bonds that we have. And so within the context of the kind of this conversion that you're referring to, and how that seems to speak to like a collectivized, a sense of being on the same page with regard to a collective narrative. Maybe could you maybe elaborate on the perhaps tension there between the kind of familial and the solidaristic through that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you're pointing to is exactly right. So in these narratives, and again, I just can't stress how utterly commonplace these were, but this assertion of similarity, of resemblance, of recognition, right, was always really, really crucial. And I don't know that this always has to happen with the discourse of, quote, solidarity, but at least in this context, solidarity was very much about was very much functioning as a form of kind of putative kinship, of resemblance, of shared, of kind of shared substantiality, right? That one could posit in a narrative by picking out particular qualities. And in this context, those qualities were always classed and raced and in these kinds of ways. And I think that often happens in projects, political projects that aim to produce a sense of commitment or solidarity across difference. Often one of the narrative techniques that's mobilized is to say, these people look so different, and yet look, we can find similarity, right? That's how all kinds of sympathies, right, are attempted to be produced. And there are real pitfalls, right, with that as a technique, it seems to me, because, well, precisely for the reasons that we're talking about. Yeah, I don't know. I think that that's something you can see in, you know, any number of different political projects, right, that aim to show good thinking, right thinking, middle-class people that they should be sympathetic to somebody who might seem quite different to them, or they should ally themselves with someone who they might at first glance might seem quite different to them, but is actually just another person just like you, a mom just like you're a mom, or whatever, right? So I think thinking about the rhetorical tropes and the poetics through which we try to build solidarity is really crucial.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for the wonderful presentation. We'll have more conversations afterwards. And so we're going to move on to the fourth speaker of the day, Laura Villa. She's an assistant professor of Spanish at Queen's College. She received her PhD in Hispanic sociolinguistics from the Graduate Center. She has investigated language ideological debates surrounding the promotion of Spanish in Brazil, the language standardization and nation building in the mid-19th century Spain, in particular on the officialization of the Royal Spanish Academy spelling norms. Today, she's going to talk something very different, the Hispanic paradox, narratives of the hard-working immigrant. So join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me and an honor to participate in the second symposium of the CUNY Glottopolitical Studies Group, and to do so with amazing colleagues as Jillian, Karina, Sarah, and Bonnie. Really honored to participate. And I would like to start by saying that what I'm going to present is not even a work in progress, it's a working starting. I don't know if there's something that can transmit that idea, but it's kind of a new research coming from a project that I did together with Lara Alonso, who I hope is among us today, and that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by talking about that project a little bit, and how I see new ideas coming from that project. So all ideas from what to do next are extremely welcome today. Lara and I, which are here in this picture, in each end of the pictures, participated together in a research seminar in Switzerland that was organized by Alexander Duchesne on language under capitalist transformations. This was 2 years ago in the summer. And Alex invited pairs of scholars working together on language and capitalism in different times and different parts of the world. And Lara and I participated in that seminar with a work that ended up being an article just published at the beginning of this year in Language, Culture, and Society, titled Latinos Bilingualism at Work in the US, Profit for Whom? And I would like to thank Lara for allowing me to show part of that research here today. And for working with me in this project that we enjoyed so much. So the article looked at the discourse of the economic worth of languages in a globalized economy, especially in the US in the context of the post-2008 economic crisis, and how we saw that discourse developed in the business world, but also in educational spaces and the media, and how that idea that language and language skills are worth it and are rewarded in the labor market is now common sense in the US. In this work, by the way, we used Jillian's work on economic sociability in Northern Italy, and of course, Bonnie's work on language and labor. So it's extremely amazing to have you both in this panel. So what we did in this article was to, on the one hand, analyze the discourse of the like the bilingual advantage as it appears in educational settings in the business world, and then we did a small ethnography to see how that discourse also appeared in the narratives of young Latino bilingual workers, and also to see how they used their linguistic skills in their jobs every day, and whether or not they were rewarded for their bilingualism. And what we found basically is that although their bilingualism is not rewarded, they are not compensated economically. Like New York bilingual Latinos use their linguistic skills every day at work. And so we concluded that their bilingualism is exploited, but not rewarded. So the profit is not for the bilinguals, but obviously for the companies that have two workers for the price of one. We saw that there is also a glass ceiling in the sense that bilingual Latinos usually work on entry level or medium tier works, and in those kinds of works, their bilingualism is appreciated by the employees because the bilingual skills are required to talk in face-to-face encounters with the clients. But like other research in the field, we found that they are rarely promoted to higher end positions. This we explain this in more detail in the article, but we tie this to the racialization of Latinos and the portrayal of the language as worth of exploiting but not compensating. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that article, but I want to just focus on the discourse of the worth of language in the globalized economy as it appears in the educational setting. And I'm taking this book that we analyze in the article as a point of reference, because what we see in the recent years is that the discourse of the bilingual advantage is being used by bilingual advocates and activists to defend policies that promote bilingual education. Resorting to these discourse, we think is problematic in the sense that we, as educators working with the Latino population, we think should be looking at the material conditions that our students endure and try to change those material conditions for the better, do what we can as advocates and activists to change those. And we think that resorting to the bilingual advantage or the discourse of the worth of bilingualism falls short of those commitments, in the sense that it tends to comply with the needs of the market and with the discourse of the bilingual advantage as it is, as it appears in the business world, which we see as problematic, and we will see in a minute. Also, the book, which intends to show that there is a explicit, tangible bilingual advantage with, in a collection of essays that fundamentally use statistics and statistical analysis to show that bilingual advantage, ends up not finding a strong evidence of that bilingual advantage, which is, it's not new. It's what other scholars in the field had found, so it corroborated those findings. So what the book does when those findings are not, supported by evidence, is to project an idea for the future, and to hope for the future that this will change. Like, given that languages are more and more important in the globalized world, it's obvious that in the future, bilinguals are going to be compensated. And this is basically what these quotes from the book suggest, that we may not see it now, but this, the evidence that we collected in this book suggests that in the future we will ultimately, etc. The idea that the advantage is not happening now but will happen in the future kind of obscures or conceals that the bilinguals are not rewarded by their bilingualism now, first, and that the material conditions of the future may not differ from the ones of today, which, may end up in the same context, in the same situation in which bilinguals will continue to be exploited. So we see as problematic, like, promoting this discourse of the bilingual advantage as a way of promoting a positive idea of our bilingual students, and hoping for the future that they will benefit from their bilingualism, because it keeps it doesn't confront the hardship of the present of those communities that we are supposed to be advocating for, which are Latinos bilinguals, right? And also we see these discourses problematic because once we accept that the reason why bilingualism is worth it is that we live in a globalized economy, and that that capitalism always listens to the market and the conditions of the market, we tend to accept the rules of the market. That is, we tend to accept that certain languages, certain speakers, those that are balanced bilinguals, will benefit, whereas other languages, other bilinguals, etc., will not. And we don't fight that idea actively. So one thing that we saw, and this has to do with how we portray our language and bilingualism in universities, and this has to do with the neoliberalization of universities that Bonnie has been studying. studied, and we promote this idea a lot. Be in Spanish programs in all universities, and this has to do with how we market our courses. We tend to resort to this idea that bilingualism is worth it, and we see a problem with that in the sense that it accepts the exploitation of bilinguals instead of focusing on the structural conditions that prevent them from gaining material rewards from their linguistic skills. And we also, by accepting this discourse, accept the very idea that languages are skills and our students are bundles of skills and they have to portray themselves that way. So it's the, So we see this discourse in the narratives that we collected from young Latino workers. And so in our ethnographic work, we distributed a survey, and one of the questions was if they think that speaking Spanish will help them promote in their company. And I'm just bringing one example. One participant said that it definitely has its benefits to speak Spanish because when you're bilingual, they pay you more because you can help others that don't understand English. I brought this example because it seems that this is coming from material experience, but she's currently unemployed. And in fact, when she talk us about her past experiences, she said that in her previous work, Spanish was not necessary, and the only people that spoke Spanish were the cleaning people. And for her, it was very important to be able to communicate with them in Spanish because she learned that they were not earning enough money. So these are kind of like the two ideas that we found in the book as well, like hopes for the future versus what we find in the present, right? Another question was whether they have been given extra work at any point in their lives for speaking the language, and many of them were actually given extra work and had to spend more time doing tasks that were not part of their job description because they were bilingual and they could help translate or they could help communicate with other people. But a lot of our participants don't see this as a form of exploitation. And this was going to be originally the focus of my presentation today, like this idea that helping others and this discourse of solidarity is how they one way in which young Latino bilinguals describe their ability to use both languages at work. Another common way of thinking about their bilingualism at work is like a kind of investment for the future. So they may not be rewarded now, but they think that being bilingual and using the bilingualism actively in their work settings right now will help them promote in the future. Will give them brownie points with employees in the future. All right. So instead of focusing on these narratives, I'm going to focus today on another idea that connected with this, and that we tied these ideas of hoping for the future with the discourse of the American dream, where if you work hard, you will be compensated in the future. If you are not compensated, it's because you are not working hard enough. And that's something that we see in our students, like the idea that you have to work hard and then you will be rewarded. So that idea of the hardworking immigrant is what I would like to focus in the future. And the way I want to do that is by kind of analyzing critically the liberal discourse of immigration that are available in the country right now. This is coming from an organization called the New American Reality, a conglomerate of business leaders and politicians. This is their webpage, and among their principles, they include these to increase opportunities for immigrants to enter the United States workforce and for foreign students to stay in the United States to work, so that we can attract and keep the best, the brightest, and the hardworking who will strengthen our economy. And then it says something like, we can create processes for immigrants to come to work in works when Americans are not filling those vacant jobs and things like that. So it's like, it's the idea that, the New American economy portrays a positive idea of immigration, but is always tied to the benefit, the economic benefit of the United States. And the reason why I'm focusing on this today is because they just published a report on immigration and COVID-19. And if you see at the bottom of the image where it says key findings, why the key findings for the New American economy is that immigrants work in healthcare a lot, especially women, that they work in works where they have more risk of contracting the illness, that they are critical for food supply chains, that immigrants make supplies that we need to fight COVID-19, and like DACA eligible immigrants and undocumented are essential workers. So the idea is that this, which again, it's a positive idea of immigrants because they are working hard and they are helping us in this country to overcome the crisis. And what I find obviously problematic with this liberal discourse, positive idea of immigration, is that it kind of conceal the realities in which the Latino population is right now during the crisis, because the coronavirus crisis has impacted Latino communities and immigrant communities more severely than other groups, and they are, like contracting, both Latinos and Blacks are contracting the illness, the virus more often or at higher rates than whites. So instead of talking about, again, the material realities of the Latino population and the structural conditions that make these realities, the New American economy and other liberal discourse on immigration treat immigrants as second-class citizens that are here just to help us. And so they are welcome, but they are not us, right? And so as I was preparing for this talk, a friend of mine sent me this article, Now is the Time to Learn from Hispanic Americas. The Hispanic Paradox could offer a model for civil society. And that's why the Hispanic Paradox ended in the title of my presentation today. I didn't know about this tropo, but the Hispanic Paradox, if there's anybody that doesn't know what it is, started in the medical field in the late 80s and 90s, and it refers to the fact that Hispanic Americans that immigrate to the United States, despite of poverty and discrimination, tend to live longer than Blacks and even whites. So researchers have been debating why, and it seems that the idea that the Hispanic community solidarity and has strong connections with the community, and they help each other, and family is a very important structure for the Hispanic community. It's the explanation that is being given for this paradox, right? So the author of this piece went to a small town in Portland. The piece is about how, you know, Latinos that have been hit hard by the coronavirus and lost their jobs and whatever, they still are helping others. And you know, like, it's very positive, and it ends up, the article ends up saying that we need to learn from this community that helps each other, and they are should be a model for us, right? And at the very end of these quotes, it said the social fabric also isn't a perfect shield from a pandemic, but it helps us, and perhaps there is a lesson in that for all the rest of us. And this ties very well with the idea of the hardworking immigrant. In fact, the comments mention that idea very, very often. I'm just going to read the first one of the comments to the article here. US immigrants, we come to this country to work hard, provide a better future for our family, and instill good values in our young ones, do good in school, help those in need, be kind to others. So it's a very positive idea of immigration, but it's the idea of working hard and helping others, and going beyond, you know, like what humanly possible one can do and share with others, and regardless of poverty, right? Like, it's what the part of this discourse that I think we should problematize and evaluate critically. Of course, in a moment where, you know, under the Trump administration, where we are bombarded by very negative portraits of immigration, where we are witnessing family separation and forced sterilization of women in detention centers, these positive images of the immigrants are welcome. But my question is, how far do this liberal idea of the good immigrant worker takes us to change real material conditions in which the Latino community lives? This is another example of that idea of Latino workers defined as by their ethic of the hard work that Lara reminded me that we used in our article and sent to me a couple of days. So I have more questions than answers here, but in moving forward, I think that I want to both analyze discourses that promote this positive image of immigrants and bilingual workers, as I said, or confront those with discourses that emphasize the material conditions of immigrants and bilingual workers and the structural barriers to improve those material conditions. And a couple ideas to do this would be maybe a genealogy of the Hispanic paradox, or a genealogy of the American dream. And this is something that Lara and I have been talking. The American dream, it's a very pervasive discourse in the country, and we are, you know, we would like to look at it in historical perspective, and maybe that could help. And for another research, I've been very interested in how mainstream history, you know, like, permeates the way that we think about the present and the future, and not only the past. So I'm thinking here, like, maybe a political history of immigration, and maybe a political history of bilingual workers could help. In this, of course, these are not new ideas. So for this last project, I'm thinking maybe more pedagogical materials more than research per se. Maybe pedagogical materials to confront all those readings about history that students, our students in our classes have done in high school, about, you know, like the melting pot and the good immigrant and assimilation and etc., and confront that with a history of the exploitation of immigration, but also you know, like the resistance. Immigrant groups in history have been responsible for, or part of, very important movements that changed labor laws, for instance, and I doubt that our students know that. So this is what I have. for now, and any ideas to move forward, as I said, will be very, very welcome.
All right. You can unmute yourselves and clap. I'd like to invite people to make a comment or a question. Anyone? And Jillian.
Hi. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I just wanted to share something that I really related to was with the bilingualism in the workplace, especially because, so before COVID, I was a waitress and in a heavily Latino, heavily Black neighborhood. But for some reason, I was one of only 2 Spanish speakers as a server. And my workload was like triple what my other coworkers was, because I would keep getting brought around to translate for everybody. And that would also like affect my tips, and it would bring my money down because a lot of my tables would be left unattended while I'm running around translating for everybody. And another thing that I wanted to bring up in being bilingual worker as well is that you also have to kind of speak the right Spanish to be considered a good Spanish speaker, because being half Dominican and half Ecuadorian, my Spanish isn't the standard. And a lot of the times when I would speak Spanish to people, I would get weird looks. So sometimes I've always felt like my Spanish was a disadvantage because I didn't learn the quote unquote right Spanish. And my career field I'm hoping to go into is nonprofits, and I'm hoping to open a nonprofit for Latin Americans. And I'm hoping to work in the development department of that. So being in the development department, I have to work with, it's kind of like I have to work with more so donors and like upper class people who have more money that I'm trying to get to support my cause. And also being in that field, I have to really think about the way that I'm speaking Spanish and really trying to make it the standard proper speaking Spanish. So in that way, I just feel that being a bilingual speaker has been kind of a disadvantage for me. And I just thought that'd be an interesting point of view to share.
Thank you so much, Layden, for sharing that with us. Very eye-opening for those of us that didn't have the experience ourselves, to have someone sharing those experiences with us, which resemble a lot what we hear from other Latinos. And I think that we cannot do enough to share your story and other people's stories, because precisely what the discourse of the bilingual advantage does is to conceal or erase your voices from the common sense idea or the common sense or the mainstream way of thinking about bilingualism in economic terms. Thank you for sharing.
Jillian?
I just wanted to, this was a wonderful talk, Laura, and I immediately went to try to download your paper. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm so struck by the just continual iterations of always sorting groups of immigrants, right? I mean, there's the model minority for South Asians, and then this like hardworking Latinas, and it's just, you know, what are the good ones and what are the bad ones? Right. And it doesn't do anyone any good because it's always limiting and always against, you know, a white unmarked norm that doesn't have to get defined. It doesn't have to get, you know, accounted for. So I'm so happy that you're doing this work, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you go forward and talk about this history of immigration. Thank you.
Thank you. And what is more, you know, like that's a strategy to pit workers against one another. You know, like you're immigrant, you are US born, you're a good immigrant, you're a hard worker, you are not, you're this, you are that, you are not. So it's a way to also promote solidarity among the working class, you know. And that's what really, I think, you know, like what interests me more about this, you know, like discourse of the good hardworking immigrant and how it has permeated to the level of the self, and not on, you know, the workers themselves, their families, their communities. And we all think about good and bad immigrants in the United States right now. Hardworking, it's a necessary condition to be a good immigrant. And I think that we should problematize that. Who is benefiting from that?
And the family structure too. Sorry, that's all I'll say. I don't want to take any more time, but just that family gets into what kind of hardworking they are, right? They're not hardworking for themselves as individuals.
Right. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to the Symposium on Narratives and Inequality. We're gonna now have the closing lecture by Bonnie URCIUOLI. She's a Leonard Ferguson Professor of Anthropology Emerita at Hamilton College, where she's taught over 30 years and engaged in extensive linguistic and cultural anthropological research, and has received numerous awards and grants, including those from Spencer Foundation, National Science Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and Ford Foundation. Her work has been illuminating on public discourses of race and class, among other topics. Her ethnography, Exposing Prejudice, Puerto Rican Experiences of Language, Race, and Class about Nuyorican, has been a classic study, widely read, and have been important in training students in linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics. Her more recent edited book called The Experience of Neoliberal Education came out a couple of years ago, and she's now about to launch this is a forthcoming book, Neoliberalizing, quote, Diversity in Liberal Arts College Life. She will be giving, I think, preview from that book, part of that work, and her talk is entitled The Pseudo-Equality of Neoliberal Diversity in Higher Education Marketing. Join me in welcoming Bonnie.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or 42, I timed it, and then questions. All right, so this is, we start with the issue of diversity in white public space, okay? Can people see that okay? All right. In recent decades, marketing has become increasingly central in higher education. So you got people whose job it is to maintain or raise the school's market position, and they've come to use diversity. Actually, they started doing it early on to point to markers of difference, mostly race, in ways that make the institution look good, without engaging in the actual workings of inequalities marked by signs of difference, especially race. In that way, marketing narratives use the idea of diversity and the terminology of diversity as a neoliberalized construction of difference, whose primary function is to serve the institution's brand by pointing to the institution doing good. So drawing from my study of liberal arts college marketing at my home institution, which is Hamilton, but I generally call it the college, and with a glance at its peer schools, I show how the semiotics of diversity in college promotional genres reinforces white public space. This happens in college diversity statements, which we're going to look at, where reference to diversity tends to co-occur with all this stuff about communities of individuals, perspectives, experience, intellectual rigor, problem solving, not often social justice. It also, as we're going to see, happens in narratives about student career paths, supposedly generated by students, but actually generated by the Office of Advancement. And these are set up to reflect a kind of personal brand that feeds into the college brand. The giveaway is not the term diversity itself, but the genres in which it occurs and the registers from which those genres precipitate. The narratives I mentioned have genre structures generated by college promotion offices and attributed to students, usually with nice pictures. There are registers in which people can and do talk about diversity to get at what systemic racism is and does, but you don't find those most of the time in higher education or the corporate world, because neoliberalized diversity registers never had that property, not since they came over from the corporate world into academia somewhere around, I don't know, late 80s, early 90s. the whole point to corporate diversity discourses is precisely to not talk about conditions of inequality, because what you're talking about is workers is all somehow equally diverse. So the whole point to the idea of neoliberalized diversity as an institutional or organizational register is that it fits in with and recreates white public space. So these discourses and genres are highly performative. White public space, as the late great Jane Hill explains it, is the sociolinguistic space in which whiteness is privileged, a space of entitlement in which forms of hierarchy and control can be performed in multiple ways without accountability. Such space is sustained through the operation of principles of markedness and unmarkedness. Markedness in the sense of, unmarkedness in the sense of people's social identities belonging to the larger world they inhabit is typical and taken for granted. Markedness in the sense of in some key way not fitting in. So as we'll see, they have to be like reorganized in order to fit in. The very nature of unmarkedness in a hierarchic system is that it need not be accounted for. Hill focused on Spanish as an index, Hill showed how Spanish as an index of non-whiteness demonstrated the entitlement manifested in the United States through the ongoing racialization of Spanish as not belonging in white public space, while at the same time she showed how mock Spanish, as she called it, flourishes in that same space, i.e. through Spanish words and phrases recast as white Anglo wordplay, supposedly funny, fleas Navidad, Drinko de Cinco, that kind of crap. All right. Hill focused on metapragmatic activity that was manifested as linguistic forms, mock Spanish or pejorative metapragmatic statements about linguistic forms like accents, use of Spanish. I think, though, that privileged pragmatic activity in white public space can also manifest itself in less obvious formal ways. For example, in the pragmatic configurations that you see when diversity is used on college websites in relation to, as we'll see, community life experience, individual selves, and so on. Whatever diversity is in these usages, it can be counted, it can appear in pictures, even though it's never exactly defined. But you can see it in bodies of students who appear to illustrate the demographic categories of African American or Latino or Asian American, and then numbers are provided. So diversity invokes race as a visually specific kind of attractive student, and it's important that these are like attractive visions. These are types that fit category, these are types that can be counted. And then schools recruit students who can embody these numbers and visuals, and who, as we're gonna see, can serve as the site for success narratives that are as much about the school as about the students. All this presentation of diversity is shaped by the white public space of the school itself and its primary market, which is generally white and upper middle class. There's plenty of students on aid at these schools, white as well as students of color, but they're not the target market for the schools. Okay, so let me give a little history of this project. I started in a small way in the mid-90s as interviews with undergraduates about their perceptions of coming to the college as Mexican kids from Chicago, Puerto Rican kids from the Bronx, Dominican kids from the Heights, and so on, and recasting their identity over their college career to Hispanic or Latino. Latinx hadn't been invented yet. And how they came or did not come to think of themselves as multicultural. At this point, the diverse and diversity were just coming into institutional use. The project expanded as I started taking into account the institutional dynamics involved in this shift. And that led me to look closely at the marketing angle in which diversity became increasingly dominant by the early 2000s. This produced a dozen or so articles and a book, which ought to be out in 2021. Over that time, some things changed, some did not. The institutional rhetoric has sort of changed in that the college, in keeping with its peers, makes these little revisions in its website language and self-description every few years. But what really has not changed is the basic metasemiotics, the organizing set of assumptions about how markedness is supposed to be fit into institutional priorities. Also not changing much, if at all, and for not unrelated reasons, is the institutional experience of the students, and I might add faculty, who serve as what we might call the diversity content providers. I apologize that I can't get into this at all in this talk, but half the book is about it, and I've written a lot about it elsewhere. Okay, so when the term diversity itself came into usage in the 1990s, its semiotics were strategically vague. It's not gotten any less vague. It variously signifies race, gender, nationality, class, kind of, sexual orientation, very delicately pointed to, and sort of ability, although in higher education, age does not count as diversity. It can also signify what states people come from, or just in some unspecified way, different kind of students. So by signify then, I mean sort of point to notions of something rather than any semantic notion of clear denotation. The significance of diversity at any given moment depends on who uses it, where, how, and when, to what end, but it's within these rough parameters. Now, while I only examine its use in higher education, that use does, as I said, come from the corporate world, as it originated as a neoliberalized signifier treating unequal forms of social difference as only difference, totally ignoring equality. So picture a row of identical bottles with different colored, stuff in them. This allows diversity to be something everyone has. And there were a bunch of diversity management people who started writing in the early to mid 90s saying, we're specifically doing this so that people don't think of diversity as affirmative action, because that's all political and we don't want that. What gives diversity value then in the corporate model is that workers ideally use it for organizational benefit, especially profit, making it sort of like a soft skill, although we're going to see later on, it's really not a skill exactly. In turn, the organization's promotion of diversity points to that which is good about the organization. So this is evidence in these works and websites, and the go-to one is really the one on the screen in front of you, the diversity wheel conjured up by Marilyn Loden about 25 years ago, which is made up of qualities every individual has. So if you look at the circle in the middle, you've got ethnicity, race, sexuality, income. You see how it's all balanced off so that every one of these things is like just one of a bunch of things. And then the outer ring is stuff that is considered in this model more changeable, although how first language becomes more changeable is, anyway. So this became the dominant metasemiotic for organizational institutional diversity. And I have been to a few diversity workshops on hiring faculty that use exactly this model. It points to some notion of race because it allows you to count these numbers and you can see race as a property of person, and it allows you to ignore any notion of race in any kind of systemic sense. This strategic deployment of indicators with structural imbalance stripped away allows organizations to point to how progressive they are, as Sarah Ahmed has pointed out in her work. The neoliberal formulation of diversity in higher education is part of a larger corporatization of higher education that was visible certainly by 1990 and very much by 2000. And you can see it in the development of all these ancillary businesses of prejudice reduction workshops and diversity consultants in academia, such as were critiqued by Chandra Mohanty in her 2003 book. And she points to the neoliberal element driving this commodification of diversity in higher education, saying, if complex structural experiences of domination and resistance can be ideologically reformulated as individual behaviors and attitudes, they can be managed while carrying on business as usual. And that management is what we're going to be looking at. All right, so a little stuff on what I'm doing with register and genre. College diversity statements, I think, constitute a promotional genre. They're intertextually sedimented from corporate diversity registers that now saturate higher education. I'm getting my register idea roughly from Asif Aga, how people use language when engaged in particular contexts and activities. So the pragmatics is in a continual state of formation. Registers are characterized by co-occurring forms and functions, that is, social interpretations that point to index elements of context. As Aga puts it, they become repertoires of performable signs. And then I see genres forming out of that interdiscursively or intertextually, so I'm roughly getting this out of Bauman and Briggs, from registers as relatively stable patterns of characteristic co-occurring features. Here the intertextualization is among all the promotional offices in all these different colleges and universities. I'm going to look at two promotional genres, the college diversity statements below, and then later on student narratives, alleged student narratives. So here we have some diversity statements from, the first one is from Hamilton, and the second one is from Williams. Now, the text in red indicate the key co-occurring usages in this genre. The text in green is indicating something that we would think of as, you know, like social justice issues and diversity. However, that doesn't show up nearly as much as you might think it would in these institutional statements, except for Williams. Williams is pretty good. But the ones I want you to look at are the ones in red, which are, here, I'm going to have to collapse that. Whoops, which, you know, notice the use of we, the diverse student body, different perspectives, life experience, breadth, rigor, intellectual life, community members, critical conversations. And then these are from Amherst. They have a little bit of equity language, but much more emphasis on intellectually challenging and educational environment, culture of critical and compassionate campus engagement, members of college community afforded the opportunity to reach their potential as active participants in a global society, diversity is a natural condition of the modern world, which is highly a problematic statement, intellectual community, etc. Now, the one that I find most interesting is Middlebury's, which is really corporate. We do all this stuff. I want you to becoming our best selves, a variety of backgrounds and different viewpoints, resilient, adaptive, solving problems, reaching complex goals. So this one's super neoliberal. They coalesce into an effective community that benefits from the talents and identities of each individual. Okay, so let's see, expand that again. Now, these websites are obviously loose about what diversity actually is, but they emphasize all the stuff about protecting and nurturing membership in the institutional community. Does that sound like race to you? No, it doesn't sound like race to me either. As a genre, you get all this reference to different kinds of individuals, but nothing about race as a social formation. Kind of, all right. The other thing I want to mention here is this use of we. and every one of them does it. Okay, we, our, we. And what that indicates is a deictic positioning through some unspecified we, speaking as the school or for the school through whatever offices are responsible for these statements. So all of these co-occurrences signal to outsiders and stakeholders, not just the students and their parents, but employers and trustees, the school's concern with a safe, intellectually vigorous, blah, blah community that's going to produce practical people, otherwise known as good students. So what the hell's a good student? The figures that take center stage on these websites are these ideal community members. They're not real students. They're figures of value-bringing future workers. They're made visible in college photography. They're enumerated on fast fact pages. They make it possible to connect demographics to visuals, to indicators of the student body's distinction and the school's status, especially the schools here, which are old, well-endowed, physically beautiful. And for most of their history, white, upper class, upper middle class, upper class, and male, although I think Middlebury did go co-ed much earlier than the other three. So diversity is kind of a retrofit. The good student illustrates the qualities we saw in all that text. It's a diverse range, whatever diverse is, of hardworking, focused students engaged in goal-oriented activities like studying, athletics, performing. They enjoy themselves safely. And all this figures into the college's reputation because they're marketable products of elite liberal arts education. And so they're central to the college brand. And, you know, it's like, this is what you're paying for, people. And they also let employers know that these people are going to fit into and advance to executive roles. All right, so this also frames how diverse students are imagined. Images and narratives of socially marked students are organized in ways that project them as a subset of good students. And this framing invests signs of markedness with neoliberal value, obviously. While it pertains to all exploitable signs of difference identified with race, gender, class, and so on, what's most commonly pointed to as diversity are signs of non-whiteness. Again, these are personifications of an idea which are illustrated by pictures of specific students, but they're really projections of institutional values. Now, if you go to the college webpage and you click on admissions, you get these three sets of images, which are all screenshots. And you can see some good students doing good student things. So there's three items. There's study what you love, be who you are, find your future. And I don't know, I thought there was a college building, but now I kind of think it's an airport, you know, I'm not sure. Each of these has a button that you can click on that gives you more pictures of students with information about their graduation year and what it is about the college that they like and what their passion projects are and so on. The most relevant of these two are what I'm talking about right here is what happens if you click on the Find Your Future page. So this little doohickey down here, Find Your Future, which you can't click on because it's a screenshot, but anyway. So I want to tell you a little bit about this bit. If you click on that, you're going to find about 185 of these narratives, and they start in 2011 and they run up to 2020. And they're put together by the college's Office of Advancement. And it all started with this initiative from the college trustees, which started about 10 years ago, where they got this idea that instead of the Career Center just finding people jobs, it should be part of a life course. And people start in this life course when they matriculate and they have a first-year experience and they're trying to get faculty to buy in. Good luck with that. And what with one thing and another, the idea is to show how the outcome of this shows all the things that the school did to make it possible, okay? And all of this is backed up by the following op-ed. Now, the guy who wrote the op-ed, Steve Sadoff, was chairman of the board of trustees when this initiative got started. And this is an excerpt from op-ed originally published in Forbes.com, and I believe 2014. And you can read it. I'm just going to pull out the important things. He's talking about this thing that he calls liberal arts skills. And that even though liberal arts education is, you know, this vague thing, really students get these liberal arts skills from it. And if you don't appreciate it, it's bad for everybody. And parents are tempted to want their children to specialize, i.e. do something vocational as soon as possible, but you have to take the long view for what's best for their careers. Now, you know what he's doing. He's trying to sell liberal arts education, which doesn't train anybody for anything. So yeah, some students might want some specialized, specific set of skills, but most, he's very unclear about this, but he's talking about class, will be better served by this liberal arts education, which is more likely to help you get into your first job or graduate school. And liberal arts graduates also credit their undergraduate experience with helping them develop broad range of important skills. He never actually talks about what these skills are, you understand. Now, specific skill set, narrow skill set, all of that is about particular forms of knowledge and technique. Broad range of important skills, that kind of fits into the idea of soft skills, which is, you know, basically they're social skills. But the usual ones you hear about, like team communication, time management, it's really plebeian. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something much more like Bourdieu, cultural capital, except you don't mention class. But they are a signal to employers that these kids you're going to take from liberal arts schools are going to, they're going to show you how well they fit in. And then you're going to love that, and you're going to make sure to send some money our way. Okay, now let's look at some Find Your Future narratives. I selected 8 of them. Here they are. And as the little note on the bottom says, these are good student types. So they're all about images. And you can read my little note with my sort of bitchy little comment about Persian analysis. The way they get these things is when students get a job, you know, they're invited to tell their story. So they're sent a bunch of questions on email, and they respond to the questions, and then the people in the advancement office who write these things pick out the answers to the questions, and they reshape them into an article, and then they post them online. All right, now, all of these have recurring elements that fit this good student narrative genre. The green is goals. And it's all about you, it's not just a goal like an outcome, it's an intended outcome. It's something that reflects well on the student and reflects well on the school. The red is not just what classes you took, but how you did internships and off-campus programs and even extracurriculars, and they get fraternities in there somehow, and sports and clubs, and how all of this is seen as part of career prep. So you'll notice what they're doing. You know, academics becomes one in this long line. You majored in X and you played football, right? All right, the purple, this here, is particular forms of knowledge that you acquired. The highlighted yellow is connections. And then the key ones are going to be this orange, personal identity markers, usually markedness markers, but not always. but this think Loden's diversity wheel, you know, who you are, where you come from. And then this ties very much into 6, which is student character. And it's all these it's going to be expressed as statements about how students see themselves in the future, doing good, willing to take risks, knowing how to manage their lives, and above all, having a passion to do something. All right. And finally, all of these are organized in a very linear way, as if all of these things connected point right to this. And this is never accidental. It's never like, well, if they are, it's not posted on the website. It's never, yeah, I just needed a job. All right, just like good students never waste time. All right, so what I did here, I'm gonna kind of leave it up to you guys to read most of it, but you wanna look for the bit that's underscored, okay? But if you have a moment, you can glance at the rest of it. So you get these patterns that show up. One of the patterns is where people are from. This first guy, and he's kind of an outlier, actually. I love this guy. He's like, nah, his passion is going to turn out to be like he likes Seattle. And, you know, so even though he's Asian male, possibly Chinese, the only way he invokes his markedness is he talks about having had finance internships back in China. And the rest of it, it's like, you wouldn't know the school had a whole hell of a lot to do with this, except for a few classes he took, mostly internships. This one's quite different. This, I don't know if you can see it. This young lady is Asian Caribbean, and she got this job as an editor at Brown Girl magazine. We're gonna come back to this one. And whoever wrote the article made sure they foregrounded that she's South Asian and Caribbean, and her parents are Indian from Guyana. The next one, oh, I skipped one. Okay. This young lady is an African-American woman from New York, and she landed a job at Goldman Sachs, not bad. She talks a lot about her connections, but she also talks a lot about being back home in New York full times, inspiring other young people where I come from, okay? So you see a little bit of a pattern of using points of markedness, because even though this doesn't explicitly mention race, that's about race and class. This one is a lot less overt. This is a white guy who wants to go into disability services. And then he says here, I have a minor disability, so I have laptop accommodation. And then we see how this inspired him to do what he does next. And then we have a young Latinx woman who, I forget where she's from, but she talks about being from an underprivileged community. I came from a community like that. So as she goes off to do Teach for America, this is going to be about, again, this giving back to where she came from. And you see that in, out of the 5 things I just showed you, the only one you don't really see that in is the first one, who had internships back home in China. All right, now, when students, here we are back with the guy from Amazon again. When students talk about the kind of work they do, there's this idea that they're supposed to be excited about it. This guy, what are you excited about? I really loved Seattle, and I'm excited about being able to work from home. Love it. However, the young lady who's going to work at Goldman, I'm looking forward to working among the best people in the industry, contribute meaningful work to the company, with people fresh out of college. I'm going to be a global citizen, develop global solutions, join a company with a huge commitment to diversity and inclusion, which I was unaware that that's what Goldman Sachs was. And I've, you know, okay, so you get the picture. I am not putting these kids down. There's a reason why we're getting a lot of this stuff, and I'll get to it shortly. All right, this young man is a Latinx guy from, I think he's from probably DC. And he got a job with Urban Teachers. And what excites you, what excites you about the program? Okay, I'm going to have my very own classroom. I'll be free to experiment with different methods. I'll get to work closely with students of my own. It'll be fulfilling. I'll be able to capitalize on the knowledge. It all comes full circle. These two, let's see, this is the person at Brown Girl Magazine. The most exciting thing about working at Brown Girl Magazine, this is down at the bottom, having that younger generation in mind, having the platform to talk about perspectives not really present in the media, super important. And long-term, she wants a career that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, possibly in marketing. Okay. Now this is the guy who is going to be a disability dean. And you'll notice that a little bit like the guy who got the Amazon job, his reaction to what he found exciting is a little more subdued than the other ones. I want to create universal design environments. And then, let's see, hold on. This young lady is, whoops, let me go back. This is a young white woman who just got into an aerospace engineering program. And she's going to start a master's in aerospace engineering. What I really want, what she finds her passion project, is to work on integrating renewable technology into existing spacecraft and aircraft. Not really anybody doing it, but I hope I can find somebody help me develop it. You'll notice that, you know, this is about an exciting passion project, but what it's not about is people like me, okay? And then we've got, let's see, a guy, an African-American guy who got a job as a medical scribe in Manhattan. And if you read this carefully, you see that it's kind of something to tide him over until he can get into medical school. But again, there's, you know, a certain emphasis on what he values about it, why this is exciting. It'll help me better understand the medical profession. His is a little bit like the guy who wants to be a diversity dean. And then this is the Latinx young woman who wants to work for Teach for America. She talks about the impact that TFA people had on her and how she wouldn't have made it here without their support. So she wants to pay it forward and give back to a community that gave too much. They serve underprivileged communities. I want to be able to work with communities like that. And then, let's see. I want to say a couple of words about passion and excitement here. Why do they take on neoliberal value? Alana Gershon talks about personal branding as a performance genre that job seekers are expected to master. Creates a coherence of self, she says, that balances expectations of flexibility that could make your skills too varied to add up to any one identifiable thing. So the linearity emphasized in these narratives, along with the idea of passion, and I would add the way these are organized around these identity markers, becomes a way of centering the student's identity as something that is clearly defined to a potential employer. And in a way, it makes the student the message between the institution and the employer. Okay, so finally, a little more about social markedness is something you bring to the workplace. This is the young lady going to work for Brown Girl magazine. Here we see how cultural identity is foregrounded as something that really operates in this personal branding, as well as something. So this is why it's not just a skill. It's an identifier as well as something that makes her an asset. And then finally, the Teach for America example. She talks about the importance of, you know, where she's from is making it possible to see yourself as a mirror so that whoever she's working with can see themselves reflected in her. All right, so let's bring that up there. So let's conclude. All right, so what these slides not only illustrate, they also construct white public space. The genre that's generated by the Office of Advancement provide the prompts that elicit particular information. And then they edit it in ways that highlight how the institution seeks to project itself. Students clearly know how to respond to these prompts, all students, marked or unmarked. Part of that is just they grew up in a neoliberal order. Some of it is they're making a polite response to an institution that in many cases has been pretty generous to them in terms of money. But there's a certain amount of Althusserian interpolation here. They are of a generation that has been addressed and prompted to respond in such terms. And in particular, I think students of color after 4 years at these schools know damn well that that's what they're expected to say. But knowing how to respond when they're interpolated in that way does not make these narratives their own story. I would say that 5 or 6 of those 8 stories are told by people for whom the college does not match the world they grew up in. And in fact, of the 30 or so interviews and focus groups, like closer to 35 students that I talked to from working class backgrounds, students of color, one of whom supplied one of these narratives, by the way. I know damn well that however interpolated they can be to project good studenthood, they are also plenty aware of the school's inequality structures, and they talk about them. So the main point is the stories are all set up to foreground good student imagery in roughly parallel ways among all students. But the very terms of good studenthood also foreground those aspects of markedness, race and class disadvantage, disability, as a quality and a resource possessed by an individual rather than as a marker of disadvantage. And these narratives point to the institution's goodness, as diversity discourses are designed to do. In those ways, they are narratives of inequality. And you can clearly see this when you compare it to students, often the same students, accounts of their actual college lives. And I have a lot of those accounts in the book and in other articles. But that is not what good students talk about, even if it's what real students do. And good students are those who enact institutional white public space. Thank you. Okay, that is it. And escape and close. Okay.
Thank you, Bonnie. Let's give her a round of applause and also ask her questions, discussion, comments.
I have a question, Miki.
Yes.
José?
Jose?
Since I'm co-host, I cannot do the little blue hand thing.
Ah,
That's anyway. Thank you so much, Bonnie. As always, your research is fantastic, and your presentation, your lecture was extraordinary. Now, I have to say that for me it was terrifying because your research confirms an experience of higher education that I've been having for, I've been in higher education for 30 years, 20 of those at the Graduate Center, a good part of that time for my sins. I was chair of a department. So my question, I guess, is an expression of hope that in your research, you found some cracks in this model, because you presented to us the discursive matrix,
right?
A particular understanding of diversity and the good student reproduce. But to invoke Althusser, whom you quoted in your conclusions, right? We know that the production of discourses is inextricably linked to institutional structures and practices, right? And so that we could call it the ideological college apparatus, if you wish. So my question is, did you find in your research cracks, that is, alternative discourses?
I think so.
Experience among the faculty, you will often find alternative discourses, right? Discourses that question the reproduction of these models. Yet, when the moment comes to transform institutional structures, everyone fails. And let me just speak about the Graduate Center. We've been paying lip service to diversity and integration for years. But the only space, the only institutional space in which you will see people of color is the meetings of department secretaries. So that's kind of my comment question.
Okay, I think about this all the time. In the book, I talk about the divide between those parts of the institution that are concerned with what goes on within the institution and those parts that project outwards. So the Office of Advancement, which used to be Communication and Development, and every school has one, right? They have to raise money. They have to attract support from big donor organizations, and they operate absolutely independently of the school. of what goes on within the school. So I really, really wonder to what extent do the trustees really believe this kind of, I'll tell you, I actually sent, articles that I was working on to one of the trustees. I have sent it to past administrators, the previous president of the school, to at least a couple of deans of faculty. It's not like I hide this stuff, and they all look at it and say, yeah, that's a problem. And then they go right on doing what they do. But I think that the sort of the performative impact of all of this is kind of, I'm not sure, how do I put this? I'm not sure people completely believe it. I think they know it's marketing, but it's convenient. So the cracks are the degree to which maybe people don't take it seriously. But then the problem is, if they're going to actually try to understand what goes on behind it, they got to do some thinking. And they've got to actually accept the fact that, no, you're operating in a neoliberal order. When I wrote the conclusion to my book, I just burned on and on for like 3 pages about, this everything I just described to you, this is no way to talk about how you are diverse. You're not making things any better for anybody. I swear to God, people will read that and say, yeah, you're right. And they'll go right on doing it. So I just don't know. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Yeah. I also think there is maybe, like you're saying, you're trying to figure out what it is, but I would imagine that maybe everybody has sort of a sense of loyalty to that institution, even though they want to change it and they want to improve it.
There is a lot.
Right? There is
a lot of that.
Some current of that. The other thing that I was wondering when you were sharing the stories about the students is that we don't really know much about their background. I don't know if you have that, but in any case, we cannot assume that all students of color are underprivileged, right? Because not all of them are first generation, say, coming to college. Maybe some of them come from parents who already went to college, who could guide them better. And so those students who are students of color who come with more privilege, maybe they already have that sense of entitlement too. And they could very well fit the narrative that the college is trying to promote. I don't know, I'm thinking about that.
Like I said, I've interviewed a lot of those students over the years. Including one of the guys who provided one of these narratives. Yeah. And, so I have a chunk of interview with that guy that goes down a very different path. But when I asked people about, what do you say when people ask you this stuff? And it's like, well, you want to make yourself look good. And this is what you say. The one that I think of the 8 that I showed you that probably is from the most comfortable background is the guy who got the job at Amazon. And he didn't talk like that. Yeah, but the other kids, I know, I don't know all of them, but I know enough about them, and I know, the ones I know, and I know the pattern. So, yeah. There, I just want to say this. A colleague of mine, Elizabeth Lee, wrote a terrific book about class in a small women's liberal arts school. I won't say anything more, but you can figure it out. And she said one of the things that they do was the students are expected to write thank you notes. The students who come in on aid, on scholarship. She said, and they do. That's, they don't like it. They think it's, kind of screwed up, but they do it, Part of it is there is this feeling of the school gave me a lot. I should do something. Part of it is just, just do it. And I talked to one of my own students who isn't represented in this batch, but could easily have been. And I asked her about it, and she said, oh yeah, we're expected to write thank you notes. We're expected to show our gratitude. And she said, and to an extent I do it. Just like when I was teaching, I wasn't always this barn burner, like, I did my little routine too.
Juan has a hand up, and then Jillian.
Okay.
I don't know if this is an actual formulated question. It's a comment and see about your reaction about it. Sure. These PR machines, these PR offices in colleges, they are very neoliberal and they engage in politics of representation.
Right.
Right. But beyond the politics of representation, PR machines are also animation machines. Animation machines in the sense that they not only decontextualize and recontextualize signs, right, and linguistic forms, right, but they do appropriate them, and they do animate the subject they appropriate it from, so that in a sense they are parroting the student.
I'm sorry, they are what? My hearing's going.
Parroting.
Yeah.
So they are parroting students, and in that sense, the semiotic process that they are engaged in is a process of animation here.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, it is a process.
I think that's what goes on with these narratives. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is important to point that out, because it is central to neoliberalism, that it's not just about representations but appropriation.
Yeah, and then that's the whole point to this good student thing.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes part of the animation.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but trying to tell people that's what's going on, then you have to explain all the semiotics, and
yes.
That's fun. Anyway.
Jillian, Jillian, and then Anthony.
Anthony can go first. I feel like I've talked a lot already, so if we run out of time, I'd rather talk first.
Do you want to go, Anthony?
I can. Thank you, Jillian.
Hi, Anthony.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for that talk. The whole time I was thinking that I wish that I had seen it 10 years ago before I started my 4 years at a liberal arts college in Minnesota as a diverse, good student, to use those identity markers that you've given us. And yeah, I was thinking, really so many parts of that, and so many parts of the narratives and the programs that are mentioned in the narratives are so much a part of my own academic experience. And I wanted to comment on two things. One, which is like this really difficult thing that you're pointing out about trying to reconcile the fact that materially this discourse of diversity, like materially in my own life, that discourse was crucial to my ability to even go to the liberal arts college, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's like one of the hardest things for me to always think about, is like, because the onus is really placed on the individual and on the student, where like that's where this discourse of diversity fails, because it doesn't recognize all of the systemic parts of that produced those possibilities. And then I was thinking about how this also functions within, just anecdotally through my own experience, on the student level, right? And how that gets reproduced in where a lot of in my experience at my college, it was where a lot of us, the good diversity students, were a group of students. We all knew each other. We participated in these programs. They were our support networks. Sometimes they're explicitly labeled as your support networks. Right. And then those institutional discourses then get recontextualized in these sort of one-on-one interactions or group interactions, where the same sort of logic we put on for our white peers who we know have access to cultural capital, that will also produce some sort of material benefit, because you're in the idea that if you can manage the system, that you'll ultimately be able to transform it, right? And then you get to graduate school, and then they're like, that's not true. You learn about all of the neoliberal ideologies that make it so that can't be true, right? And so just wanted to comment on that, and thank you for the talk.
Well, thanks. I think that is one of the most striking things that happens is, not a lot of students, and not all that many students went to graduate school for something academic. And I'm talking about white kids too. I mean, it's more now than used to be, but Hamilton was never a school that sent a lot of kids into academia. So I have known a few students who have gone on to, academic graduate programs, and they have certainly commented on the distinctions. But I think, I don't know, my sense is by the time they graduate from the school, they have a pretty good sense of what that whole ride was about. Anyway. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
No, it wasn't really a question. I guess
okay,
it's
just
more
ask for a comment. Yeah.
I wasn't at that level. So it's like when at the end of that, it wasn't this idea. There wasn't a critique of that neoliberal sort of exploitation in many ways of identity that happened, later.
Yeah. Okay, who else?
Jillian?
Bonnie, I love this work so much, and I'm so excited about this book. Although I'm sure it'll be so mad as I read it. I have like 18 things I want to say, but one of them is just like, and I'm sure this is in the book, is to note kind of alignment of this kind of thinking with audit culture, right?
Yes.
Which makes everything so countable.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's
and so
in
you
there.
can count.
Yep.
It's about representing. It's about counting the tokens.
Oh, you froze.
All the way down.
Yeah. I actually, somewhere in the first chapter, I make the point that this is a marketing version of audit culture. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, have you thought at all about the kind of like in institutional internal movements that this does? I mean, being at an institution right now that's trying to, you know, actually do something institutionally, maybe, possibly, that is about diversity, and then there's all these forces that are trying to say, let's call it racism and not diversity, and then that leads to all kinds of.
Yeah, one of the problems is that the people who administer and market this, the last people they're going to pay serious attention to are critics within the school. So I've got a long discussion in the last chapter about, you know, the school is crawling with people who do these, and you know, who analyze race from all these different angles. How come nobody gets heard in these marketing and administrative circles? We're not experts. What they consider an expert is someone who can solve their problem the way they conceive of their problem. The rest of us don't know what they're talking about. So, you know, it's like, oh, aren't you clever? Go publish your little article and we'll put it on the website as part of the mosaic. Yeah, Jose?
Yes, precisely, because I think that often the problem is not so much that you know, critical voices make it to the trustees or the high-level administrators. Often the problem is within the department itself. Often the problem is within the faculty itself.
Oh yeah.
You know, and how we refuse to transform the practices that reproduce the inequality, that reproduce discrimination. You know, we continue to reproduce, you know, the same type of fetish relationship with the book, with the referee journal, and all of that. And I think that it's right there where we have to, you know, sort of fight by being an example in those spaces in which we can control the practices, right? I can't control what the trustees think. They don't get.
But how do you get everything you know, sort of funneled into a coherent voice? And I wrote what you were just talking about. I was trying to explain that, you know, the problem, there's no organizing principle within the faculty. There's too many conflicting aims. There's, you know, I don't have time to go into it all, but basically, you know, there's a lot of competition among ideas of who knows more than whose idea counts more than who's published more on it, in what venues. I mean, it's just hopeless. So yeah, you're right. It is a mess.
Daniel and then Nara.
Thank you for all of that. Hi. I'm wondering, as a student undergraduate right now, if you see any ways of us possibly challenging this, because I personally have been used for the optics, I've been used for all these things. I've been one of those good students in the cover of the whatever website they want to add me to this time. But when it comes to me asking for assistance or basic help or just like an additional line for my department that has been underfunded since like the inception of it, I get a lot of pushback. So this is just like
suggestions.
I'm just trying to see if you can see like anything past like them publishing this, because I feel like
know.
material messages that they send.
I know. I wish I knew what to suggest. I know exactly what you mean, and I just don't know what to suggest. But I think you're right. See, I'm no good at solving problems.
Thank you either way.
Just don't shut your mouth. Just keep talking about it. Anybody else?
Lara?
Hi, thank you, Bonnie. It was to hear you, and thank you also, Jillian, Sarah, Carolina, and Laura. It was great, and Miki for organizing. So I was thinking, because Bonnie, you made a comment before on Sarah's and Carolina's talk of how they were much about the discipline of narratives and how people were not in charge of their own narratives. But hearing your talk, for me, that's even more stronger, because as Juan was also saying now with the parroting thing, you are seeing these discourses aligned to their own bodies and to their own pictures. So it's not that people are controlling their narratives, but the narratives about them, but they are controlling the narratives they are supposed to be producing.
Yeah.
And well, so but then Jose asked you if there were some, that he was happy to see that he saw that in your talk, you saw us that there were some cracks in the system. And I wanted to ask you if there are some, if you found, because you told us that you knew that these students thought different things and they had told you, but if there are other spaces in campus or in the college where these other discourses, that is actually the discourse produced by the students themselves, has any space?
In classrooms, you know, I mean, I think what happens is a lot of students do, you know, they do take classes where they figure out, they do projects where they figure out what the hell this is about. There's not a lot of play, you know, there's nowhere for them to insert it into the advertising process. And they don't have the resources to be listened to, you know, by, you know, upper level administrators or trustees who have this, you know, just these very constraining models of what they, you know, how they're going to see the, you know, whoever their interlocutor is. But I think there are more students who are more able to make themselves heard than was maybe the case when I started this project. But, you know, I just, again, I wish I knew, you know. It's almost like there's two different institutions. The one that advertises itself and the one where students actually take classes.
If I can say something, you made me think of something that I had not thought about this, but this is many years ago when my son was in medical school. And so I don't know if you can see it, but it says Rutgers, the new Rutgers, the new Rutgers. It was when the medical school and UMD&J in New Jersey transferred to Rutgers. So it says the new Rutgers. And then my son got picked with another brown student for this cover. Brown and brown.
Yeah.
Right? And we were so proud. We never thought that they were being showcased like this because of their color. I never thought of this until now. So I just wanted to share that.
I have to tell you guys.
I don't know if I want to tell him, poor thing.
You know, it's, you know, I mean, it's not 100% terrible exploitation. It's just that it's mostly exploitative. I got to tell you, I have fought a million times, starting around the time that Hamilton opened in New York, that admissions must have gone to did that guy apply here? Did Miranda apply here? And we turned him down because he could have, oh my God, what we could have done with advertising, you know, this Puerto Rican guy from New York and Hamilton, and it could be part of our brand and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure that somebody must have thought, did he even apply here? Why didn't he apply here? You know, they just, that's not just how they think about people of,
it's the mark.
How they think about people of color. It's how they think about everybody, but especially. I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's not like this is a distinct way of dealing with diverse. It's a kind of a subcategory of a larger way of thinking. And I think that's why it's so hard to crack. Anyway.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I know. Well,
any comments, questions? Well,
thanks.
Well, thank you so much for this really wonderful participation, and for the speakers too. It's been really wonderful, and I would love to keep these conversations going. There are so many questions. There are so many intersections between the talks that I am so, it's generative to think about, and how narratives are very important places to understand politics, inequality, reproduction of inequality, but also places for potential transformation. And I hope we can contribute to doing something about it as academics and researchers and participants in this society.
And a big round of applause for Miki.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I hope to see you again in this or next forum at our university. So thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everybody. Bonnie,
thank you.
We'll be in touch soon. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bonnie, I have some regrets from people who couldn't make it and wanted to tell you about it. I will write you.